A rebroadcast of Book TV's conversation with economist Milton Friedman. That program is live next. Now, an in-depth conversation with author and economist Milton Friedman.
Welcome to In-Depth with Dr. Milton Friedman. We are in San Francisco, where Dr. Friedman and his wife Rose live, and she'll join us in about 2 hours. But for the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about books and writing and Milton Friedman's career, and then we're going to open up the phones for the rest of the time. Can you remember, Milton Friedman, the first time you ever wrote anything that had an impact?
That's very hard to say. I guess the first time was when I was a graduate student, and I wrote an article that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics.
How did you feel the impact?
It was a professional impact. It was strictly a technical journal in economics. It was a criticism of something that had been written by an English professor, Professor Pagoo. It's a case which had my first contact with Keynes, as a matter of fact, because I wrote the article and I submitted it to the Economic Journal, which was edited by John Maynard Keynes at that time. And he wrote back and said he had shown it to Professor Pagoo, and Professor Pagoo didn't agree, so he wasn't going to publish it. And then I sent it to the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which was run by Professor Taussig, a very famous economist of that time. And he accepted the article.
In your book that was a big success, Free to Choose, you wrote in the preface that television is dramatic. It appeals to the emotions. It captures your attention. Yet we remain of the opinion, you and your wife, that the printed page is a more effective instrument for both education and persuasion. The authors of a book can explore issues deeply without being limited by the ticking clock. The reader can stop and think, turn the pages back without being diverted by the emotional appeal of the scenes of moving relentlessly across his television screen. What impact today do you think the word has on the page versus television?
I think what I said there is, what we said there is still true. Absolutely. I was most impressed by the diverting effect of television, by a different kind of an experience. In the 40s and 50s and 60s, the University of Chicago used to have a radio program every Sunday, the University of Chicago Roundtable. It was the most popular talk show in America at that time. Had an audience of some 6 million every Sunday. And subsequently, when television came along, the University of Chicago did some roundtables on television, and I was on some of both. What astounded me, what interested me, was the difference in the reaction. From radio, I got letters, which were a wholly different character than those I got from television. From the radio letters, people were nasty. They thought I was a devil incarnate. It was not all of them, don't misunderstand me. Many of them were very favorable. But those which were negative were really negative. On television, you get almost no such letters because people see the face. They're diverted from the thought by the impression, here's a nice, pleasant fellow with a nice smile on his face. He can't be such a nasty devil. And you get a wholly different set of reactions. And that means that radio is a better way of putting across ideas than television. And books and paper are a still better way. I'm still persuaded of that.
How many years have you lived here in San Francisco?
A little over 20, about 21 years. When I reached the age of 65 at Chicago, I decided to retire from active teaching, and that's when I moved out here.
How many years did you teach at Chicago?
30 years.
And what does it mean to be a part of the Chicago School?
Well, the Chicago School is really a collection of people who have similar general policy views. They may differ on individual policies, but in general, they're in favor of free markets, limited government, private individual choice. And that school goes way back into the 19th century. University of Chicago was established in 1890, and so it goes back to then when the first chairman of the Department of Economics was a hardcore, hard money man.
Who was with you at Chicago, names that we would know?
Jacob Viner, Frank Knight, Henry Simons. Those are the names you would be most likely to know. There were also other people, Theodore Shultz, who also got a Nobel Prize. And more recently, Gary Becker, George Stigler, Ronald Coase.
In your 88 years, and by the way, what's it feel like to be 88?
Well, I tell you, at age 50, I would have given you 100 to 1 that I would never reach 88. I come from a short-lived family. My father died at the age of 49, my mother at the age of 70. So it's a miracle that I'm alive.
You surprised to be as active as you are?
I certainly am surprised.
What's a day like for you? Any day. What do you do on a given day?
Oh, mostly I sit at my desk and write, or read, or at the computer and try to do some work. Read a book, go for a walk, nothing special. I really don't know how to describe an average day. It depends a great deal. We are fortunate. We have two places, an apartment in San Francisco and a house in Sea Ranch, which is right on the ocean. So a typical day will depend a great deal on whether I'm at Sea Ranch or in San Francisco.
What part of the United States did you grow up in?
I grew up in Rahway, New Jersey, a small town in New Jersey. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, but I had sense enough to move out when I was 13 months old. And so I took my parents to New Jersey, and then I grew up in the town of Rahway.
What were your parents like?
My parents were immigrants from Carpatho-Ruthenia. At the time they came, it was part of Hungary. Subsequently, it was part of Czechoslovakia. Then after the war, it was part of Russia, and now it's part of Ukraine. There was somebody who used to tell, somebody who lived there, who told the story that I was born in Hungary, I grew up in Czechoslovakia, I went to school in Czechoslovakia, I was married in Russia, and now I live in the Ukraine, and I haven't moved.
One of the reasons we do a program called In Depth, and I have you here for 3 hours, and your wife Rose will join us in a couple of hours, is that the audience can call and ask you about any number of books that you've written, anything, as a matter of fact, they can ask you about. But to show the extent of it, I have piles of books here. Did you ever count the actual number of books you've written?
No, I never really have. And it's hard to count books. What are books? Here you write columns, as I wrote Newsweek columns, and they're collected in a book. Is that really a book? And then you write more columns, and there's another collection which may overlap to some extent the other. Is that a new book? So I think it's very hard to count books.
Which book sold the most?
Free to Choose, there's no doubt, the one you had.
The little paperback that I have here?
No question.
And
it was a best-selling nonfiction book of the year in 1980, and it sold well over 1 million copies.
Is it still on the market?
Oh, yes, it's still on the market and still available.
How many languages was it translated into?
I have forgotten, but I think something like 20. But I don't guarantee that number.
What about this book?
Well, that's interesting. That book was published in 1962, and it's Capitalism and Freedom. It sold well over 500,000 copies. And the interesting thing about it, the reason I mention that, is when it was first published, it was not reviewed in the New York Times. It was not reviewed in the Herald Tribune at that time, which was a major paper, the Washington Post. It was reviewed in no major magazine. It was only reviewed in the technical economic journals. And the reason is no doubt because of the fact that it was in defense of capitalism, in defense of free markets, and that was not a popular topic at that time.
Here's a book that's only been out a couple years.
That's right. That's my wife's and my memoirs.
And by the way, how long have you been married to this woman on the cover?
62 years.
And she's the same age you are?
She's about the same age. She really doesn't know exactly her age, because she was born, as a matter of fact, in what is now, well, I don't know what it is now. I think it's Ukraine now. But she refers to it as Poland. It was Russia. And she came to the United States just before World War I as a child. But her birth certificate has been lost. It was burned up in the First World War wherever it was held in that town in East Europe went up in flames. And so there's a question of whether she's either 1 year younger than I am or 1 year older, and we're not sure which.
Now, in that book, if I read it right, you said that you don't read the New York Times.
Very seldom. And these days, I read it more than I ever used to because I can bring it down on the net. But I don't, as a regular matter, read the New York Times.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, I live out here in San Francisco. I read the local paper, and I read the Wall Street Journal daily. When we were in New York, when we lived in New York briefly, I did read the New York Times. But in general, I have found that it's much too wordy for my purposes. I don't really have time enough to read it. If I'm going to read it, I have to read it. And I'm not very sympathetic with their general editorial position.
In your lifetime, what other authors have had an impact on you?
What other?
Authors, writers.
Oh, whatever. Oh, there's no doubt. Probably the writer who had the greatest impact on me was Friedrich Hayek, whom I know.
And we talked about that on Book Notes.
We talked about that on Book Notes in connection with this great book, The Road to Serfdom, for which I had written an introduction.
Did you know him?
Oh, yes, sure. Oh, very well. I knew him I first met him in 1946, I think, and I knew him until he died.
Why was that book so important?
It was not, when I say Hayek influenced me, it was not simply The Road to Serfdom. It was also the other books he wrote, Constitution of Liberty, Law, Legislation. It was because it helped me organize my thoughts about the way in which society should be organized, about what was special about a free society, what were the essential prerequisites of a free society. I was generally sympathetic to those ideas, but Hayek was a very deep thinker, and he really, if you read him, you can't read him without thinking, and you can't think without having your basic ideas altered.
When did he die?
I'm not sure of the exact date. It must have been, what, 10, 15 years ago, something like that. He was born in, I think, 1896, and he lived to the age of, I think, 90, so that would have taken him to 1986.
Who in your lifetime have you most disagreed with when it came to economic theory and this whole subject matter that you write about?
Gee, that's a very hard question to ask, obviously with Marx and the socialists. But to pick out a single name from that would be going back. I should have mentioned of the people who influenced me, it was not only through their books, but equally great intellectual influence on me was Arthur Burns. Arthur Burns, who later was head of the Federal Reserve System, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, was my teacher when I was an undergraduate at Rutgers University. And he was my mentor through much of my life and had an enormous influence on me. And of course, my teachers at Chicago, where I did graduate work, Jacob Viner, whom I've mentioned, Frank Knight, whom I've mentioned, were people who had a very great influence on me.
In your book, The Two Lucky People, your autobiographies, you mentioned that the whole discussion about the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1976 that you won, that it took a number of years for you to get it. Paul Samuelson, if I remember correctly, got it early.
That's right.
What impact did that have on you when you didn't get it in those early years?
Oh, it really didn't have much of an impact. I can't say it did.
What impact did it have on you once you got it?
The major impact was not on me, but on on the publicity and on the letters and talks and requests you get. I don't think it had much impact on me as a person, but it did certainly alter my opportunities and made me much more visible and available.
When I was growing up and went to school, Paul Samuelson's text was what we had at my school. What's the difference between the way he thought? Is he still alive, by the way?
Oh, yes. Paul's still alive. He's, I think, about 4 years younger than I am.
The youngster.
And he's, although we have had many differences, we're very good personal friends.
Well, what would be the major differences in his thinking?
Oh, no question what the major difference is. The major difference is what we believe the role of government should be. I believe the role of government should be minimal. I'm in favor of a very limited state. If I had my ideal state, instead of our governments at various levels spending 40% of your income and regulating you and determining and affecting another 10%, it would be spending 10 or 12% of your income. So I would have a drastically smaller state than we now have. Paul is very comfortable with the size of the state as it is now and would tend, if anything, to be wanting to make it larger.
I have a book here that goes way back to 1939.
Oh, yes.
You know what? Have you seen this before?
Oh, sure, I've seen this. I helped write it.
What is it?
Consumer expenditures in the United States. It's a result of one of the programs of the New Deal after FDR came in office. And there were many WPA and other programs in order to provide employment and promote recovery. And among those was a program that involved getting a large-scale cost of living survey of the people, of many people, a consumption survey. There were interviewers who went out, and such surveys have been made over time, but this was the largest that had ever been made. It was a major one. And I was employed to analyze the data that came in from that survey. And this book is a result of that analysis. It gives the end result of that analysis. The group that wrote this was headed by a woman by the name of Hildegard Nieland, who was a quite remarkable and able woman employed in the government.
At the top of this, though, it says the National Resources Committee. The chairman, Harold Ickes, the father of the Harold Ickes that's working with the Hillary Rodham Clinton campaign. Harry Hopkins, who was Secretary of Commerce.
Well, all of this was pro forma. This was this is Washington. It's over big agencies in which people at the top really have nothing to do with what goes on at the bottom, divided down into a lot of subgroups.
But there is a name on here. It's in the advisory committee that I see you've mentioned before, a man named Beardsley Rummel.
Oh, yes.
Who was he?
Beardsley Rummel was, well, he was an extraordinarily interesting man. Originally an academic. He was a dean at the University of Chicago at one point. He subsequently worked for R.H. Macy and became very active in politics. And during World War II, when there was a discussion about how to shift over to withholding, he became very widely known for the Rummel Plan, which was a proposal about how you shifted. The problem at that time was that under the income tax as it was before 1944, 43, you paid your tax for 1941 and 42. There was no withholding at source, no current payment as there is now. And the problem is, how do you shift from a system in which 1 year's taxes is paid the next year to a system in which 1 year's taxes is paid in the same year? That involves double taxation if you're going to collect all the taxes. 1942, you were going to have to pay taxes in 43. But we wanted to have taxes in 43 paid in 43. And so there was a problem of forgiveness, as it was called, to get over that 2-year hump. And Beardsley Rummel became famous as proposing a Rummel plan for doing so, which was not adopted.
Give us a quick resume on the schools that you learned from, where you got your master's and your undergrad and your PhD.
I went to Rutgers College as an undergraduate. It was in New Brunswick, New Jersey, not far from where I lived. And I went there because I was able to get a scholarship. This Rutgers College at that time was very different from Rutgers University today. Rutgers University today is a multi-university, a big university in New Jersey State University. In 1928, when I entered it, it was a private college, a very small private college that was established before, one of the few colleges established in the United States before the Revolutionary War. But the state was already starting to get involved in it. And the first way of getting involved was by having a competitive scholarship. They had a competitive exam that people took on the basis of which you could get a scholarship. And I was able to get a scholarship to help pay tuition at Rutgers. So I went to Rutgers as an undergraduate.
Where'd you get your master's?
Then I got my master's at the University of Chicago. After getting my bachelor's at Rutgers, I went to Chicago. And then I went to Columbia University and got my doctorate at Columbia University.
And what schools have you taught in?
Oh, I've taught in University of Wisconsin for 1 year, University of Minnesota for 1 year, University of Chicago for 30 years, and I've taught for 1/4 or more at UCLA, at University of Hawaii, I don't know where.
You remember this book?
Oh, yes, that's A Theory of the Consumption Function. That's the best book I've ever written.
Why?
Well, it's hard to tell. As you know, the books I've written are of two very different kinds. One kind are purely technical economics. That's the best technical economics book I've written. And you ask me why? It's hard to answer that. But I think most technical economists would agree. The reason is somehow it's a nice, complete whole. It started with an empirical contradiction. Data that weren't consistent with one another. It presented a hypothesis to explain the contradiction. Out of that hypothesis, it drew implications that were capable of being contradicted by further evidence. It analyzed the further evidence that there was and found that it was consistent with the hypothesis. And the hypothesis is by now part of standard economics. So in a sense, it had a completion to it that leads me to regard it as the best book I've written.
And your preface was written in February of 1956, put out by Princeton, University of Princeton Books. It sold for $4.75.
And it's by no means my best-selling book, far from it, because it is a technical book, but it has been translated into quite a number of languages. I know Japanese. I have it at home, a Japanese translation of it. You know, it's funny when you get a book with your name on it that you can't read.
Who was the first, by the way, I want to tell our audience that we'll go to phones in about 6 or 7 minutes, and Dr. Friedman's going to be with us for another 2.5 hours, and his wife will join us in about 1.5 hours. Which was the first president to pay attention to anything you'd written?
Well, I guess that's a very hard question to answer because I don't know what presidents read. The one case I do know about is Ronald Reagan. And the reason I know about that is because a friend of mine here in San Francisco who was involved in politics, was somehow involved in inducing Ronald Reagan to run for governor in the state of California. And before that, he loves to tell this story, that he had invited Reagan to come up to San Francisco and meet a group of people whom he might talk to and try to discuss the possibilities of running. And Reagan came a little early for his appointment and was in the outer office when my friend was in the inner office. And when my friend came out and welcomed Reagan and asked him to come into his office, he saw Reagan put a book back in his pocket. And the book he put back in the pocket was that Capitalism and Freedom you had there.
Is this book still, by the way, on the market?
Oh, yes, that's still on the market.
It's a short one, too.
It's a relatively short one, but it's selling. It's a book that's been translated into at least 20 different languages.
In your autobiography, you talk about presidents and those that you've advised. Give us a...
No, let me go back for a moment, because I started a thought before that I didn't finish. These books are of two very different kinds. You held up the Theory of the Consumption Function, or that book, Monetary Trends in the United States and the United. They are technical books, scientific books, directed at the professional economist. The other set of books are books like Capitalism and Freedom, like Free to Choose, which are directed to the general public. Now, obviously, I could not have written them if I had not been a technical economist. That's Monetary Statistics of the United States, which is really an attempt to construct consistent series of the quantity of money in the United States going back to early part of the 19th century and extending through the 20th.
Started to ask you about presidents.
Yeah.
You write in your autobiography about Richard Nixon. How much time did you spend with him, and what did you think of him?
Well, a fair amount of time. I first met Richard Nixon when he was vice president. A friend of mine, Alan Wallace, who was chancellor of the University of Rochester. He was a fellow student at Chicago back in the 30s. Alan Wallace was serving as chairman of a research group that Nixon headed. And he induced me to come down and spend some time with Nixon. And I was very much impressed with him in terms of his intellect. Nixon was really an intellectual. Fundamentally, he was, in my opinion, miscast as a president. He would have been a wonderful professor if he had been at an academic institution. He had a fine mind, one of the highest IQs, I would say, of any of the people I've ever met.
You say he was different in the quiet of an office and when you saw him with the public?
He was another person. He was a different human being. I tell one story in the memoirs of a session in California during the, I guess it was during the 1968 election. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was that election, not 60. Yeah, it was 68. And in the morning, we had a discussion about some policy problems, and that was a college seminar. That's what it was. It was fine. You could talk analytically and so on. In the afternoon, there was a barbecue for the press. And out comes Nixon with waving arms. The public Nixon, and I wouldn't have recognized him from the morning meeting. So he was two people.
In your book, you say you didn't care much for George Bush.
Well, I saw George Bush, when Reagan was president, he had an economic, excuse me.
As a matter of fact, you also said, I think in the book, that you thought it was Ronald Reagan's biggest mistake to pick him to be vice president.
Yes, I do. I think the situation would have been altogether different if, for example, Ronald Reagan had taken Don Rumsfeld as his vice presidential candidate. George Bush, as I say, during the Reagan administration, I was a member of an economic policy advisory board that met with Reagan once a month or so. At every meeting, George Bush was present. He never said a word, except hello and polite, but never entered into the discussions. So I could not form much of an opinion of him. So my comments about Bush are based entirely on what he did as president. But I think as president, he tried to undo all of the things that Reagan had done. He said before in the campaign of 1980, when he was trying to get the nomination, he talked about voodoo economics. After he got elected, he went back to his voodoo economics. And I think the policies he followed, I think he made a major mistake, and he agrees that he made a mistake in approving the tax rise in what was that? 78, 1980, I'm sorry, 1980, 90, yeah, the 1990 tax rise.
We have calls, and it's time for the audience to have their discussion with you. So let's go to Roanoke, Virginia for our first call for Dr. Milton Friedman on In-Depth here on Book TV. Go ahead, please.
Dr. Friedman, can you tell me in the Constitution where the framers used the word coin, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5, what did they mean by the word coin?
Well, at that time, they undoubtedly meant what the word coin literally means, a stamped-out piece of metal. Because as of the time when the founders were working, money most everywhere consisted primarily of metallic money, of gold or silver. At that time, you had both circulating. You had essentially a bimetallic currency. And so they literally meant coin. They meant the stamped out nuggets of metal.
Roanoke, Virginia, are you there?
Hello.
You're on the air.
Do they have a right to change the meaning of words by the Supreme Court?
The question is whether what the founders had in mind was whatever is being used as money. At that time, coins were being used as money. In the course of time, we developed alternatives to coins, less expensive alternatives to coins as money. And I think it's not unreasonable to suppose that they would have included, that what they really intended was money, but money at that time was coins. And the content of the word, the content changed over time. So I would not think it unreasonable to go from coins to money.
If you've just joined us on Book TV, this is a program called In Depth. We've done a number of these this year, including authors like Joan Didion and Richard Rhodes and Bill Buckley and John Lucas, and now Milton Friedman. There'll be others before the year is over, and it's an attempt at spending 3 hours with one person. In this case, Dr. Friedman's wife, Rose, who's spent a lot of time being, kind of a co-writer with you.
Oh, yeah, sure. She's been a part of everything I've done.
New York City, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Well, my question is about what I think, and many people would agree, sick healthcare system. Having grown up under the single-payer plan in Canada, I think that's by far the best way to go, and I think many doctors, as we heard in the previous program, are starting to agree. I'd like to hear your comments on this situation.
Well, I'm afraid I have to disagree with you. I think the single-payer system is a very, very poor system. If we go to the Canadian case, you should look at their waiting lists. They have very long waiting lines for all sorts of difficulties and diseases. Indeed, at one point, British Columbia contracted with hospitals in Seattle, Washington, to perform bypass operations in order to reduce the waiting time on bypass operation. You also have a situation which under single payer in Canada, physicians in Canada are moving to the United States. Canada is losing a considerable fraction of the graduates from its medical schools to the United States. It's a bad system because a third party is involved in payment. You do not have a direct relationship between a physician and a patient. So that on the whole, I have to disagree. I think that we in the United States have gone too far in the direction of third payer payment.
Our next call is from Canada. Interestingly enough, from Toronto. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Hello.
Professor Friedman, first,
Yes.
I was dean of a medical school in Canada, and I totally agree with you. I don't think Americans would want the Canadian healthcare system, although there are very good points in it in terms of having everyone covered. I think on balance, I think the Americans would like to get to the right system. That isn't what I called about, actually. I would very much value your opinion of two individuals on the libertarian/right, Ayn Rand and an economist who, Professor Friedman, I admire even more than you, although you're a close second, Ludwig van Mises. I'll hang up and listen to your answer.
Well, both Ludwig van Mises and Ayn Rand were remarkable individuals and have made great contributions. But both of them had one defect. They were, from my point of view, intolerant. They were not willing to listen to ideas that didn't conform to their own. They demanded that people be disciples and not simply learners. Ayn Rand is particularly that way. I think some of her books are marvelous. I enjoyed them very greatly. But I've observed among people who were influenced by Ayn Rand that those who became Randites became almost impossible, while those who were influenced by Rand but didn't become Randites were influenced and then broadened their conception, became very valuable and important citizens and were very much on the right side. Let me give you a simple example. Alan Greenspan, who was a Randite originally, but was very much influenced by Ayn Rand, but obviously is not a strict, no longer would be a strict follower of her doctrines. The same thing happened with Ludwig von Mises. He was a great economist, no question. But let me give you one example. I never met Ayn Rand, but I did know Ludwig von Mises personally and met him. And I will tell you one story which will illustrate my point. He and I and other people were members of something called the Mont Pelerin Society. And at one of those meetings in the Mont Pelerin Society, one of the former students of Mises, Fritz Machlup, had the temerity to differ with Mises. Had to do with the question of international exchange rates. Fritz Machlup came out for floating exchange rates, while Mises was for a gold standard. Mises wouldn't talk to him for 3 years.
Where was von Mises located?
He was originally located in Austria, in Vienna. And then when the Anschluss came, he went to Switzerland. And subsequently, he came to the United States and was at NYU for many years.
Madison, Wisconsin, a place where Milton Friedman used to live years ago. Go ahead, please.
Hi there. I was wondering what Mr. Friedman's opinion is about continuing economic assistance to Russia, considering that the accountability that they've had for the aid given so far has been zero.
Well, I have for many, many years been opposed to foreign economic aid. I think it does far more harm than good. And the Russian case is a prime example of that. We have given a lot of money to Russia, and it has prevented Russia from establishing the institutions and arrangement which would enable it to become prosperous and free. And that's true not only for Russia. The best example of the vices of foreign aid is, in a way, East Germany and West Germany. If you take the countries in Eastern Europe, which were freed when the Berlin Wall fell, which got out from under the Soviet Union, East Germany has been the slowest one to recover and the slowest one to get better. Why? Because it got so much assistance from West Germany. It got that assistance from West Germany in ways which prevented East Germany from adjusting to the new situation. So I think it's a great mistake for the United States or any other country to give economic foreign aid. Free trade, yes. Open up the borders, let them make their way. And there is a case for military aid, perhaps from time to time. But I think there is no case at all for economic foreign aid.
We're in San Francisco at the ITN studios on Battery, if you've ever been here. And our guest is Dr. Milton Friedman. We go to Seattle, Washington. You're next.
Yes, Dr. Friedman. Could you tell me which president during your lifetime had the best grasp of economics, and perhaps the president before you were born that was most knowledgeable?
Well, I don't know about before I was born. And it's not easy to answer your question, because there are two things involved: a grasp of economics and a principled willingness to put that economics into play. I think in some ways I would say that Richard Nixon had the best grasp of economics. He understood it most deeply, but he did not. He was not willing to follow his own principles. It was against his principles to introduce wage and price control, which he did on August 15th, 1971. And he says in his memoirs that was the worst thing he ever did. But he did it, yet he understood what the consequences would be. Now, Ronald Reagan had a very good and clear understanding of economics. There's so much misunderstanding about Reagan. People think he was somehow an unlearned moron. That's a bunch of nonsense. He was a very intelligent and thoughtful man, and in particular, he really understood the many important economic relations. By contrast with Nixon, Reagan had principles and was willing to stick to his principles. So that, for example, one of the first things he did when he got into office in 1980 was to end the price controls on oil and gas, which was a very important thing. You know, everybody had been saying, oh, if you take off those price controls, the price of oil and gas will go up to the sky. The truth of the matter is, as Reagan understood and knew, after you took off the controls, After a brief interval, the price of oil and gas fell and did not rise.
Do you remember this book?
Of course. Program for Monetary Stability. That arose out of a series of lectures I gave at Fordham University in when? I don't remember the year. When was that published?
I'll have to check it. Look inside. It's a Fordham Press book, and it was first in 1960.
Just 2 days ago, I got a royalty statement from that book, and I got $100 coming to me for royalty for that book, which is still selling.
Still there. Carlisle, Pennsylvania, for Milton Friedman.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to know what you think about the surplus, what should be done with it, and the framing of tax cuts in terms of spending the surplus. Thank you.
I have no doubt what should be done with the so-called surplus. It should be used to reduce taxes. The situation is that Congress and the government is going to spend whatever the taxes will yield, plus however more they can get away with. The only reason you have a surplus today is because you have divided government, because you have a Democratic president and a Republican House. If you had both, if both had been Democratic, there would not be a surplus today. It would have been spent in additional government programs. If both had been Republican, there would not be a surplus today. Some of it would have been spent, and most of it would have been used to reduce taxes. So I have no doubt what should be done with the surplus.
Albuquerque, New Mexico, you're next.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. I'm very concerned about the stability of our economy as we go into this new election cycle, and I'd just like to hear your views on, how you think we should proceed from here to have a stable economy, and a little bit maybe about Alan Greenspan's policies. Thank you.
Well, I am, so far as Alan Greenspan's policy, to work backward, I think he has been done extraordinarily well. I think without question, the record of the Federal Reserve under Alan's chairmanship, I should say I have a bias. I'm a very close personal friend of Alan Greenspan, have been for years. But I think as a student of monetary history, I can tell you that the Federal Reserve has performed better under Alan Greenspan than under any previous chairman in the now, 85 years of its existence. At the same time, I should add that I have long believed that we'd be better off if we did not have a Federal Reserve System. I have long been in favor of replacing the Federal Reserve System by a computer. But that's not going to happen. And in the meantime, we're very well off with Alan. The more basic question you ask, our economy is doing extremely well. Why is it doing so well? It's doing so well primarily because of a technological revolution. It's really because of the computer and internet age, which has transformed technology, the way to run businesses, and so on. We have much more stability in our economy, in part because with computers and improved telecommunications and transportations, inventories are much smaller. You now have the business of on time, of inventories on time, which has improved the quality. There's been an increase in technological productivity. Those are the things that have been working for us. They cannot continue indefinitely. And sooner or later, we're going to have a recession. We're going to have a collapse. And sooner or later, we're going to have a tendency to go into inflation. What do we need to do in order to avoid that? We need to have a monetary system which will keep to a moderate level the rate at which we increase the money supply. That's the first and most important prerequisite. The next thing we need to do is to have government keep its hands out of the business. We need deregulation, privatization to the maximum possible extent. Now, those are long-term goals. They're not a program for next year, but they indicate the direction in which we should go.
Gastonia, North Carolina, for Dr. Friedman.
Yes, I'd like to ask Dr. Friedman if he'd give an honest evaluation of the influence of John Kenneth Galbraith on American economics.
You know, I don't mind answering that question, but I don't like the way it's phrased. Would you expect me, if you didn't say an honest evaluation, that I'd give a dishonest evaluation? I've tried to be honest all my life, and I intend to continue to be so. I think Kenneth Galbraith has had a great deal of influence. In my opinion, most of it has been bad. Again, I want to mention, Ken Galbraith and I are good personal friends. We've entertained in one another's houses. So I have nothing personal against Ken. I like him. He's a wonderful fellow to have dinner with. But I don't agree with his views. And yet I think those views have been very influential, particularly in the views he expressed in the affluent society.
And what would be the principal difference, again, between you and him?
Again, the same difference as between me and Paul Samuelson, that Ken is in favor of government running things. He believes that civil servants in Washington know better than people at home what's good for the people at home. That's the great vice of the interventionists, of the people who want the government to run things.
This is 1963.
That's a monetary history of the United States, and it's probably it's almost certainly the book of mine that has had the most influence within the economics profession.
Why?
Primarily, I guess, because it covers the history of the monetary history of the United States from 1867 to 1960, almost a century. But the central chapter in there is one on the Great Depression. And I think its main influence is because it changed the profession's view of the cause of the Great Depression.
What caused it?
The widespread opinion before had been that it was caused by a breakdown of the capitalist system. And what we demonstrated in here, and I think demonstrated so that it's now very widely accepted. I say we, because that was a joint publication. My co-author was Anna Jacobson Schwartz, who was an economist at the National Bureau in New York City, and who is a very well-reputed, internationally well-known economic historian. And she and I collaborated together for something like 25 years. So on the whole, there are a series of 3 books. You held up to the other 2. There's that Monetary History of the United States, Monetary Statistics of the United States, and
Monetary Trends.
And Monetary Trends, those 3 books. So to go back, we demonstrated in there that the reason for the Great Depression was the fact that the Federal Reserve System made a major mistake in policy, that it did not carry out the policies for which it has been established. The Federal Reserve System was established in 1913 as a sort of a result of repeated banking panics during the 19th century, and in particular, the banking panic of 1907, after which there was a governmental commission established to explore what had happened. And out of that came recommendations that led to the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. And it was established for the purpose of preventing banking panics. And we had the worst banking panic in the history of the United States while the Federal Reserve System was supposedly doing it. And the Federal Reserve System, during the course of the panic, was saying, oh, how much worse it would have been if we hadn't been here. The usual behavior of bureaucracies. So we established, but I think we established in here that let me get some dates in here. It wasn't the stock market crash. The stock market crash came in October of 1929. The recession, which turned into the Great Depression, started in August of 1929. And for the first year, it wasn't so bad. But then in the spring of in 1930, and particularly at the end of 1930, there were a series of bank failures. And the Federal Reserve, instead of doing its business of providing liquidity to the banking system to prevent the spread of failures, tightened monetary policy. The Federal Reserve permitted the quantity of money to go down by a third from 1929 to 1933. Actually, there was only $2 of money in existence in 1933 for every $3 that there had been in 29. And all the time it had the power to prevent that. And all the time the purpose for which it had been set up was instructing it to prevent it, and it did not. And I think we demonstrated that that mistake of the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression. And I think that had the further effect that you will not have such a Great Depression again.
Rockville, Maryland, you're next.
Hi, Brian. This is Audrey Emerson. I met you at the University of Maryland. I have 3 questions for Mr. Friedman. First
Triplicate.
I'm sorry?
Triplicate.
Triplicate, right. Regarding bureaucracy, I know you're against it, and I want to ask you to speak, please, about the medical insurance industry as a bureaucracy, because I think that the reason that we're looking toward a single-payer system is because of the negative influence of the medical insurance industry, which started many, many years ago and led to HMOs and led to the present discontent, which is now leading to a wish for the single-payer system. Also, with regard to regulation, how in your ideal world would you protect the worker, the people who feel as though they are the exploited classes in the absence of regulation? And the third question is as more of an observation. Ayn Rand and her influence. Just recently I was in a bookstore and saw a whole shelf of Ayn Rand's books, who was very controversial when she was in her heyday and who was very unpopular when she was in her heyday. But I have a theory, which was formed at the moment I saw that row of books, that it's her influence, her very dogmatic influence, that has, she has influenced especially the Christian right and the very dogmatic elements in the Republican Party today.
All right, Audrey, thank you very much for all that. Did you remember?
Yes, I did. I wrote the 3 things down. Let's start with the insurance companies. I think you haven't dug deeply enough about the source of the problem. In my opinion, the real source of the problem is the exemption of health services provided by employers from the income tax. Why is it that most people today get their health insurance through their employer? That isn't a natural thing. Why don't you get your food through your employer? You used to have company stores, and there was a lot of scandal about company stores. Mining companies in the West, when there was no community around, would establish a store, and their workers would get their food and their clothing and their housing, everything through the company store. And we have company stores only in medicine. Why? Food is more important than medicine. Why shouldn't we say that food provided by the employer is tax exempt? The reason we have tax exemption goes back to World War II. During World War II, we had wage and price control. And and we also had inflation. We also had a lot of money being spent by the government on armaments and big deficits and rapid money growth. And that meant that there was, as always, a shortage of workers because you couldn't raise their wages because it was illegal under and yet there was a great demand for them. And so employers started to provide fringe benefits. And the most popular fringe benefit was the provision of medical services. And employers did not report what they spent on medical services as the income of employees to the IRS. And the IRS, as with most bureaucracies, was kind of slow to catch on. It took it 2 or 3 years. And when it finally got on, it instructed the employers to include the cost of fringe benefits in the wages reported for income tax purposes. Well, by this time, the workers had been taking that for granted. And they emitted a howl, and a howl big enough to make Congress pass a law exempting the provision of medical services from the income tax. If one bad law, namely wage and price control, led to another bad law, which was the exemption of medical services, medical provision.
How about regulation?
Well, let me go one step further, because it was that which leads to the dominance, to the fact that most people get their medical care through their employer and through insurance. Now, the solution to this is to, in my opinion, is to either to eliminate the tax exemption and cut taxes accordingly, let workers get more of their pay in cash, but let them take care of their own medical care, or medical savings accounts, which would have the same effect. And that would reduce the role of the insurance companies greatly. Medicare has also, of course, helped in this connection. Anyway, don't get me started on medical care, because that's a big subject all by itself.
What about regulation, and how do you prevent?
The question is, how do workers get protected? Yes. That was the question. Who protects workers? Workers are protected by competition from other employers. The way you protect workers is by enabling them to have many employers who can use their services. That's a much more effective protection than union protection. Now, union protection may be good for those in the union. It doesn't do a thing for those who are unemployed because the union keeps down the number of jobs. It doesn't do a thing for them. There's a role for union in terms of internal negotiation and bargaining with the employer. There's certainly a very important role. But there is no real role for unions in protecting workers in general.
Ayn Rand and the impact on the Christian right?
On Ayn Rand. I think there's much in what the caller said, because Ayn Rand was very dogmatic in philosophy, in temperament. She fits in with the Christian right and with people who are very dogmatic in their beliefs. But she herself was not religious at all. She was a complete agnostic.
New York City, from Milton Friedman. You're next.
Dear Mr. Friedman, I have a question for you, and it's with regards to the internet bubble. Is there an internet bubble? Will it burst?
Is there a bubble in what?
In our current economy, and will it burst or deflate? And what would happen if it would burst? I'm talking about the overvaluation of the stocks in the United States.
Well, it depends on what you mean by is there a bubble. If you take usually that refers to the market, to the stock market. And if you take the stock market as a whole, it's a mixed bag. I think there definitely has been a bubble in internet stocks, and perhaps in some high-tech stocks. But if you take the rest of the market, the non-high-tech, non-internet, it hasn't shown much of a bubble at all. So I'm not sure that there is bubbles certainly do exist. You had an extreme one in Japan in 1980. But so far as the United States today is concerned, I don't think we need to be concerned much about the bubble.
Another Milton Friedman book, this from 1994.
Yes, that's a collection of articles, really, on money, on various aspects of money. You know, money is such a fascinating subject, because everybody knows everything he has to know about money, and nobody knows very much about money.
What about this one? University of Chicago Press.
Yes, that has to do, that's Milton Friedman's monetary framework, and it has to do with a sort of an intra-professional dispute between myself and several critics.
Let's go to Pensacola, Florida next. Go ahead, please.
Professor Friedman, I would like you to briefly summarize your views on economic science, which you laid out in your famous essay, The Methodology of Positive Economics, and to summarize it and then tell us how that approach differs from other views of economic and social sciences.
Let me ask the caller from Pensacola, have you read Dr. Friedman before?
Oh, yes. Yes, I read him in graduate school, and to this day I still read him occasionally.
And what do you think of his theories?
Oh, I like him very much. I liked his Capitalism and Freedom very much, but I also liked very much his methodology essay. I've also read the Freedom to Choose book.
Well, so far, what the caller is talking about is an essay that's in a book, Essays in Positive Economics, that green book that you have there.
We have not shown the audience this one yet.
Yeah, that's one. That's right.
When did this come out?
Oh, I don't remember.
I'll check it.
Sometime in the 50s, I think. I think it was one of the earliest. And I have an essay in there called The Methodology of Positive Economics, which was not published anywhere else. That's the original publication. And what the caller is referring to is that in that essay, I try to argue that economics as a positive science is no different from natural sciences, and that what economics is concerned with is constructing hypotheses, simple hypotheses to explain complicated facts. And the test of a hypothesis is not in the assumptions that are made in deriving it, but in the implication, but in whether it makes predictions that are confirmed by evidence. And it goes back to a big argument within the economists about the proper methodology. It really ties up again with Ludwig von Mises you were talking about earlier. He and many of his followers have a philosophy which is called by a strange name, praxeology, Praxeology. And their argument is that economics is fundamentally different from the natural sciences because economists have a source of information which they know to be true, which is the internal beliefs and knowledge. And we're trying to study human beings, and we are human beings, so we know ourselves in a sense in which a physicist can't know a piece of metal, or a physicist can't know, or a biologist can't know a rat. And that economics as a science is to be derived from this internal knowledge which we have, this subjective knowledge. It's a subjectivist approach to the methodology of economics. And my essay in positive economics is an attempt to argue against that, and to argue that that's a very unreliable source of information, that it may be a good way to derive hypotheses, but you cannot accept what you come out with unless you can produce predictions which were not known before and which turn out to be correct and confirmed. And as the caller said, that was a source of a great deal of argument within the economics profession.
Milton Friedman and his wife Rose live here in San Francisco and have for the last 20 years. And as we established earlier, he spent 30 years at the University of Chicago as a teacher. You were at the University of Minnesota for a while, University of Wisconsin for a while, UCLA for a while. Columbia, did you ever teach?
Yes, I was there for a year as a visiting professor.
We're in the ITN studios at near the Embarcadero, I guess you would say.
On Battery.
On Battery Street. And we're going to be here for another 2 hours as we continue this discussion with the audience. Dr. Friedman's wife, Rose, will join us in about an hour. We'll talk to her for a while and then continue the calls. We have, this, by the way, is a 1953 copyright from the University of Chicago. Is it still available for people?
Oh, yes, sure.
How many of your books are still being sold, do you know?
I have no idea.
Is it still a good income?
Oh, no. Well, I shouldn't say that. A reasonable income from some of the better sellers, but in the main, no.
Irvine, California. Go ahead, please.
The only ones of these which ever gave a reasonable income were Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose. All the other, it's peanuts.
Go ahead, Irvine. You're on the air.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask about a theory or a proposal for taxation at the national level that was proposed by Professor Edmund L. Fige, I believe it's pronounced, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Wisconsin. I note in reading a paper of his that Dr. Friedman was somebody who helped comment on this paper at one time or another. And Dr. Fige's theory is called taxing all transactions, or an automated payment transaction tax. It sounds like an interesting approach because it broadens the taxation base considerably and reduces the incidental rate of taxation at each transaction. Could you comment on that if you recall his paper, sir?
I don't recall his paper, but I know what you're talking about. And a transactions tax has often been widely used. It's a very bad tax, not a good tax. It seems to have a low rate, but that's because when you come to the final thing that you're taxing an automobile, let's say. But if you use a transactions tax, you've earlier taxed when the rubber was purchased by the people who are going to make the tires, when the tire was sold to the manufacturer of the car, etc., so that there may be 10 or 15 or 100 transactions involved before you get to the final product, which is what you're really imposing the tax on. And the result of that is that you get very unequal taxation depending on how many transactions enter into the process of creating a final product. Moreover, the transaction tax encourages uneconomic combination of stages. In order to avoid the tax, you get vertically integrated, and so the same company grows the rubber, makes the tire, and does all the other operations. And that may or may not be economical. And if it's done only to avoid the transaction tax, it's surely uneconomical. Well, Russia, for many, many years, used to have a transaction tax. In fact, that was the main tax that Russia used during its, I should say the Soviet Union used during its heyday.
You have a foundation. What does it do?
Yes, we established a foundation a few years ago to pursue one of our pet causes. Some 45 years ago, I wrote an article on the role of government in education, in the course of which I proposed the use of a voucher as a way to enable parents to choose the school to which their children went. And we've been interested in the voucher business and the voucher idea ever since. And a couple of years ago, we decided we weren't going to be able to play much more of a role in it because of our age. And so instead, we decided to set up a foundation, which is called the Friedman Foundation for Personal Choice.
And why is it based in Indianapolis?
Because the person we found to run it, who does a marvelous job in running it, Gordon St. Angelo, happened to be living in Indianapolis. And it doesn't matter where it's based. The idea and purpose of it is to try to educate the public at large about the issue. It's the only foundation which, so far as I know, has as its exclusive function trying to develop a greater understanding about the importance of parental choice of schools and of various ways in which that can be done. Smith. And we have set it up, I want to add one more thing. We've set it up so it will terminate. It terminates 5 years after the last of the... We have 3 people, myself, my wife, and Gordon St. Angelo, who runs it. And after the death of the last of those, it's got to terminate in 5 years. One of the things I very strongly object to are these indefinitely lived foundations. I think all foundations ought to terminate at a limited time.
How old is Gordon St. Angelo?
Well, he's younger than we are, but not that much younger. He's doing this after retirement, I should say. He was employed at the Lilly Foundation. That's how we got to know him. We knew him for many years. And Gordon is now, I'm not sure what his exact age is. It's in the early 70s.
Smithfield, Rhode Island, for Dr. Milton Friedman. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Dr. Friedman. It's an honor. I've read on the Hoover Institute website, on one of the transcripts for Uncommon Knowledge, where you were talking about the deficits of the 80s.
Yes.
And you said they weren't caused by tax cuts nor by increased spending, but by the administration's effectiveness in controlling interest rates. And I was wondering if you can elaborate upon that.
I'm not sure I recognize what you've interpreted me as saying. We're talking about the deficit of the 80s after Reagan cut taxes. And they were not caused by, that's right, what you, the first thing you say is absolutely right. In my opinion, they were not caused by the tax cuts, nor by the increase in spending for the military, but they were caused by the success in reducing inflation. All of the estimates that have been made, none of them attributed as much, none of them thought it would be possible to reduce inflation as much as it was reduced from 1980 to 1984. The reduction of inflation meant that tax receipts were reduced very much, because the main thing that had been driving up tax receipts had been bracket creep, that inflation was pushing people into higher income tax brackets and hence requiring more and more money to be going to the Treasury. And when you reversed that, when you had negative tax, you had a decline in inflation. Instead of capital gains coming in, you had capital losses coming in. Instead of income tax going up very rapidly, you had them going down. So the main source of the deficits was a mistake in the estimates which people had made of the amount of taxes that would be received.
I noticed that you were at one time on the board of directors of, is it Aldine Book Company?
Yes.
Who is it named after? And here's a book published by the Aldine Company.
The Optimum Quantity, yeah, that's right, the Optimum Quantity, Money, and Other. Well, Aldine Publishing Company was started by a friend of mine. I may say, I have long had the policy of not serving on boards of directors. And that's the only corporate board of directors I ever served on. And I only served on it because it was a friend of mine who started that company. And we, in fact, invested money in the company. So
is it still here?
Kind of, what?
Still a company?
No. The company was, that company was later liquidated or was sold to De Gruyter. So it's now, it's still being published, but it's being published by essentially a different publisher, but under the same name of Aldine. Now, I've forgotten why where the name Aldine came from.
San Diego, California, you're next.
Yes, hello. I'd like to first say thank you to both of you gentlemen for contributing to the public good in both your particular endeavors. And now you've teamed up and for the dynamic duo on Sunday here. I must say that as far as Mr. Friedman, your long life, thank God that you are still alive, because such a source of honesty, integrity, and just correct reason is rather refreshing in these days of all the economic gibberish that everybody seems to be throwing around. I had earlier you mentioned that everyone seemed to think that Reagan was some sort of half-witted moron, and I certainly don't agree with that. And one example that I don't have very much information on that perhaps you can enlighten the United States people of would be that there was some sort of conservative element that wanted to perhaps curtail government spending by going back to a gold standard in the early Reagan presidency. And I believe they issued a gold commission report. Some sort of committee must have been formed on it. And it mentioned something that that would be a very bad idea, or perhaps not a good idea, because the United States Treasury owned no gold supply, or very little perhaps. That's what I'm not exactly sure about. Something about that all the gold that perhaps was put in Fort Knox was owned now by the Federal Reserve as collateral on our current national debt. And I wasn't sure if that was an accurate statement, but I just wanted to get your opinion on that, since you may have been involved closely in the Reagan administration. And would you, as a, Martin Luther King had a dream, and I got my own pharmaceutical delusion myself, and I was wondering, what do you think the possibility would be, instead of the central banks running the world and fleecing the middle class, what would you think about if every country around the world produced its own debt-free money supply from their treasuries, and somehow there could still be a mutual exchange rate, so global economics could work out fine, but in the end that would save the middle class and poor, untold sums of money. And so I was just wondering about that fantastic idea, and also about the Gold Commission of 1981.
Well, but every country in the world does now do what you're saying. Every country in the world now, no country in the world now has a gold standard. No country in the world now has a currency which is backed by anything than the faith and credit of the government that is producing it. So your ideal money standard, in a way, is inexistent. Going back to the gold situation, it is true that there was a gold commission that was set up during, I guess, in the 80s sometime, and it presented a report in which I think there was a majority report and a minority report. And the majority report argued that there was no basis for having a gold standard, which I agree with. I think the gold standard was not a bad system in the 19th century. It had many virtues. But it existed at a time when governments were spending about 10% of the national income, when governments were playing a very minor role in the economy. I do not believe a real honest-to-God gold standard is possible in the 21st century, when governments around the world are spending something like 40 to 60 to 70% of national income, and when governments everywhere are playing a very important role in the economy. Now, as to the situation of the gold in Fort Knox, after all, the Federal Reserve System is really a branch of the government. It's nonsense to think of it as a private enterprise. It isn't. It was set up sort of as a private corporation. Technically speaking, it's owned by the member banks, which have shares of stock which they can't sell or do anything with, but that's strictly a fiction. It's essentially a government agency. And so you really have to consolidate the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. All of the gold in Fort Knox is owned by the U.S. government and would be available to undermine, to support a system of gold currency. But that isn't going to happen and shouldn't happen. I have long been in favor of the United States having a big auction. Take the total gold stock we have, divide it into 5 parts, and auction off 1/5 of it every year and get rid of it. We have no more business owning gold and being having a storehouse for gold than we have for owning wheat and having a storehouse for wheat, for owning sugar and having a storehouse for sugar. We should get out of the business.
By the way, we have callers that probably call at least once every couple of days, and they're very concerned about the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderberg Group.
Oh, yes.
You're on the conservative side of American politics. Are you concerned about those groups?
No, I'm not concerned about those groups. They're perfect. I am not involved in any of those groups, and I'm not on the conservative side. I am not a conservative. I am a libertarian. I am not a member of the Libertarian Party, but I am a libertarian. I always say, when I'm asked this question, I am a libertarian with a small l and a Republican with a capital R. That is, I'm a member of the Republican Party, but I'm not a conservative.
So you don't think any of those groups run the world?
None of those groups run the world. They are all groups of people. Many of them, the Council on Foreign Relations is an eminently respectable outfit. It consists of people who are fine people and who have, they publish a good journal, what's called a foreign, I've forgotten the title of the journal.
There's either a Foreign Policy Journal, and there's 2 of them, I think.
2, yeah. No, I don't think any of them are running the world.
Let's go to Durant, Iowa. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Dr. Friedman, I wanted to tell you that your book, Free to Choose, is a book that I require my students to read. I've taught college several times before, and it's a wonderful book for freshman and sophomore level. Free to Choose is highly recommended by me for kids that show up and raw minds that you want to turn them on to what's really going on in the world outside. You want to understand it. I always ask them to certainly read Free to Choose by Milton Friedman. I want to tell you that I really enjoy your book.
Where do you teach?
Taught at Kirkwood Community College in Cedar Rapids.
And what's the reaction from your students to a book like this?
The reaction to the students that are really interested in education is wonderful. And they come up to me and tell me that they really appreciate reading that work and getting turned on to it. And I always tell them that if you want to really know what's going on in the world, certainly in America, and what's going to happen on the world stage as we westernize the entire globe, Free to Choose is what you need to read because it's so simple to read. It's so easy to read. Try to read The Affluent Society by John Galbraith. It's terrible to have to sit down and get through it. Free to Choose is so easy to read. It's a book that I would recommend to anybody. My question to Mr. Friedman is one that might be a little outlandish, but I tell all my students that if we can survive socially, science holds the promise to eradicate all disease of mankind. The problem we have is, will we survive socially? And of course, economics ties so close to our society and social matters. Down the road, if this comes true, if we do find the secret to aging, which I believe we really will someday discover the secret to aging through genetics, if we do, I'd like for Dr. Friedman maybe to comment a little bit on how it would affect our economy and the world stage into this century and maybe the next. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if by surviving aging, curing aging, you mean that we would live indefinitely. I have no idea what the world would be like with people who had no hope, no expectation of dying. It would be so utterly different a world. You know, I don't have enough imagination to figure that. If you mean living to a riper, older age, so that I'm not the only lucky one who can live to 88 years old or to 100 years old, I will make that. But assuming you can get to that, well, then the world will be not very different from the way it is now. It will be different in some ways. The big industries will be recreation industries rather than the child care industries. The age population of the world will be very differently distributed. But fundamentally, it will look very much like the present world does. I don't think it'll have any major economic implications.
Well, no doubt.
I want to go back to one more thing, though, about that book, Free to Choose, because of what this caller said. He said it was simple to read. And the reason is a very direct one, and it's related to your business. Unlike most cases, we did a TV program, a 10-part TV program called Free to Choose. That was done before the book. The book was based on the program, not the other way around. And as a result, we started writing the book with the transcript of the program. And when you talk, you have to be simple and straightforward. And so that book is the only one of our books which started with talk and ended with words on pages, where all of the other books start with words on pages.
Can you still see those television programs?
Oh, yes. Well,
there's a website I know that...
you can buy the... oh, yes. You can't see the television programs in the sense that I don't think they're being broadcast, but videotapes for them are for sale from Chichester. Gee, I wish it...
It's on the screen. Actually, it's the ideachannel.com is where they can go for information.
That's right.
And then they can find out where to buy them.
Yeah.
You tell a story in your autobiography that the New York public television station didn't run those programs at a time you thought was worth
Well, they ran it with next to the Super Bowl.
Do you think it did it on purpose?
Yes. Oh, there's no doubt they did it on purpose.
Why?
Well, because for the same reason that the French television channel never showed them. They had shown John Galbraith's program, The Age of Uncertainty, the year before. But although they were under great pressure and people offered to pay for it and so on, they refused to show our program because it was not ideologically correct. You know, political correctness is really important. And we weren't ideologically correct. And the New York station, like the New York Times, like New York in general, is a left-wing, collectivist, socialist. We were, from their point of view, right-wing, individualist, free market. And so they weren't very favorable to it.
Dr. Friedman's been with us for an hour and 25 minutes. He's got an hour and 35 minutes to go, and he's going to be joined by his better half here in about 35 or 40 minutes. Before, let me take a call, and I want to ask you about aging. Seattle, Washington, go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian, and thanks so much for C-SPAN, and I love this format. Dr. Friedman, as a fellow small L libertarian, I was thrilled that the tide, the ideological tide and political tide seemed to be running in your direction during the 80s anyway, especially if Al Gore is reelected. What would it take to, and the Republicans seem to be running away from Friedmanism too right now, what would it take to swing it back toward Friedmanism?
People like you, people like all of us. I don't believe you'll swing it back by necessarily voting, but I think you'll swing it back by persuading other people that what's going on is something that should not be going on. I think the growth of the role of government in determining our life, the idea that the only way you can give a tax cut is if it's a reward for doing something that some government bureaucrats thinks you ought to do. It's disgraceful. And it's only if people like you and other people recognize how disgraceful it is. You know, the idea, the biggest corruption in the world is the idea of buying votes with the money of the voters. That's what both parties are engaged in. One worse than the other. The Democrats, no doubt, carry it much farther than the Republicans. But the Republicans are not averse to buying voters' votes with the voters' money.
Earlier you were talking about aging, and you're talking about your father who died when he was 49 years old. What have you done, you think, in your life that you and your wife have lived to be 88? Anything special?
It's not what we've done. It's what the science of medicine has done. My father died from from a heart attack, from angina pectoris, the closing of the arteries. I would have died from that too. I would have died at the age of 60 from that if it hadn't been for the invention of bypass surgery. I was lucky. The first bypass, I had my first bypass surgery. I've had two of them. I had my first one in 1972. And the first bypass surgery done in the United States was in 1966, 6 years before that. So I was just lucky. I have lived as long as I have because medicine has made such wonderful strides. The thing that interests me about medical care is the contrast between the enormous advances in the science of medicine and the terrible, not advances, but the opposite of advances in the organization of medical care. Here you have wonderful scientific achievements which have been of great benefit to people. On the other hand, government spending, total spending on medical care has skyrocketed. It's gone from about 5% of the 4 to 5% of the national income in 1945 to 17% now. It's incredible what's happened. In 1945, we spent twice as much on food, clothing, and drinks as we did on medical care. Today, we spend twice as much on medical care as we do on all of those combined. And in addition, do you know any other item in our lives about which there's so much dissatisfaction and about which people complain so much as they do about the organization of medical care? Why? That's what's really interesting about the subject. And I believe the answer is because government has been playing too big a role.
For Dr. Friedman, Blytheville, Arkansas. Go ahead, please.
Yes. About a year ago, I took a class at the London School of Economics called the European Union and the New World Order. And what surprised me, many things surprised me about the class, but what surprised me was how the European Union thinks nothing about manipulating prices, government intervention. They don't allow the forces of supply and demand to take hold. And in essence, they don't play fair. And it concerns me that, you know, if the European Union really pulls this off and gets this going, we're going to be at a great disadvantage with them. What do you think about this?
Oh, I don't think we're going to be at a great disadvantage with them. The manipulation of prices, it's not within the European Union alone, it's within individual countries in the European Union, has led to the fact that the European Union countries have had unemployment for years now up in the range of 10%, that they have had very slow growth. They are hurting themselves, not us. We would benefit if they would if they would reduce regulation, deregulate and privatize, and have a better economy, because then they would be better customers for our products, and they would have better goods to sell us. So European economy, as a matter of fact, they're doing reasonably well. But I share your criticism of them, but not because it's going to bother us.
I have a little book here that was published back in 1969 by Norton called Monetary versus Fiscal Policy. And it's you debating Walter Heller, who was active in the John F. Kennedy administration and Lyndon Johnson. But he starts off by saying, it is difficult to work up anger or even indignation in a discussion or debate with Milton Friedman. He is always so charming and so disarming, even when he's dead wrong. I mean, it's almost what you said of John Kenneth Galbraith. Listening to Milton, I was reminded of a postcard I got in Washington from a Montana observer whose message was, quote, "Don't you go getting reasonable with me while I'm busy getting mad at you." Do you remember?
Oh, I remember that debate very well.
These debates.
Oh, yeah. That debate concerned what was really a very central issue in the whole Keynesian, non-Keynesian monetarist dispute. What matters? What is it that most affects the course of the economy? Is it the ins and outs of fiscal policy? Is it the level of surplus, the level of deficit? Or is it what happens to the quantity of money? And my position in that debate was that it was what happened to the quantity of money. And Walter's position, and Walter was, again, a good friend of mine. That's a more interesting story, because I'll come back to it. But Walter's position was that it was fiscal policy. And I think by now, things have settled down, and it's pretty well agreed that monetary policy is much more important than fiscal policy, for the purpose, not for some purposes, but for the purpose of keeping the economy on an even keel. But the funny thing I was going to say, when I was at the University of Wisconsin for the 1 year, this was a long time ago, 1940 to 41, there was a kind of a dispute got involved. People wanted to have me fired. And Walter Heller was a student at that time at the University of Wisconsin, and he carried signs and pickets on my behalf.
Is he still alive?
No, unfortunately, Walter died at a relatively early age.
Cody, Wyoming, you're next for Dr. Milton Friedman.
Yes, Dr. Friedman, I'm a small L libertarian also. I'd sure like to know your observations and opinions about the Libertarian Party and its presidential candidate, Harry Browne. And secondly, if you were to design or change this tax system to support the federal government, what would it be like? Thank you. I'll hang up.
If I were to design the taxes?
Tax system.
Tax system. There's no question on that. That's easy to answer. I think the tax system I would design would be a simple flat tax on all income above a minimum from whatever source derived, period. It would be a single flat rate. Unfortunately, given how much government spends now, it would have to be a flat rate around 25 or 30%, which is much too high. But that would be better than this incredibly complex system that we have now. Now, in addition to that flat rate tax, the only other thing that you should have are really taxes that can be regarded as payment for services. That is, for example, there is an argument for a gasoline tax as a way of paying for the highways, for taxes which are specifically devoted to services that some people use and other people do not. Now, on the first question, I think very highly of Harry Browne. I think his program is not one that is feasible politically at the present moment, but that would be desirable if it could be adopted. I have never myself been active in the Libertarian Party, not for any reason, not for any particular objective reason, but only because I thought I could be more effective and influential by working within the Republican Party.
I have here the essence of Friedman.
Yes.
Did the Hoover Institution think this was your swan song back in 1987?
No, but Hoover has been putting out a whole series of books. They have the essence of Hayek, the essence of Stigler. They're going to have, or have already, the essence of Becker. They are simply collecting the major writings of the people who are on the staff at the Hoover Institution. Now that shows the difficulty of counting books. Is that a new book? Everything in it has been published somewhere else.
That was 87, and you were 75.
Yeah.
And how long have you been associated with the Hoover Institution, or what is it?
The Hoover Institution is at Stanford University, but it's a separate institution, which was established by Herbert Hoover in the 20s, I guess, mostly as a repository for the documents and the material he had accumulated during his service during World War I, when he was running the Belgian food, the food program. And what it is a research institution devoted to analyzing. It's a Hoover Institution on War and Peace. I think I've got it roughly right. And its purpose that Hoover set for it was to study the sources of conflict among nations, the sources of, and try to promote programs that would eliminate war and promote peace. And what it is a general research agency that studies all sorts of economics and social and political problems. As I say, it's at Stanford, but it's independent, an independent institution at Stanford. It is not a teaching institution. It's entirely a research institution.
George Shultz, Thomas Sowell,
Right.
Peter Robinson, others. Who else is down there?
John Cogan, John Rezian is the director of it.
Do you meet? Do you go there?
They have very frequent. I used to go there much more frequently than I do recently, as it's become more difficult for me to travel, just from aging. But I go down there. I have an office there and a secretary there, and it's enormously useful to me as a place. And there are seminars almost every week. There are 2 or 3 or 4 seminars at which papers will be given, some discussion. Every afternoon there are people meet for coffee and you know, it's a usual academic kind of an environment. It's a very productive environment. It's been very productive. Hoover scholars have produced an enormous amount of writing and have affected public policy in many ways.
We go to Fairfax, Virginia next.
Hi, Dr. Friedman. My girlfriend and I are young economists at George Mason University, and we're learning so much so quickly, and it can get frustrating. I was just curious if anything still gets you angry, that people think a certain way or certain things are happening, and what you think of the current situation. Thank you.
Well, what we think of our what?
Current situation.
Current situation. Well, the current situation in the United States is on one level very good. Economic output is high. It's growing rapidly. We have very low unemployment. We have relatively low inflation. It's too good to last, and it won't last. But I'm not making a prediction in terms of time. We know too little to know how long it can last. There's no reason it can't go on for a while. But sooner or later, you're going to accumulate difficulties. You're going to accumulate problems, and we're going to have temporary periods of recession and of decline, but not major depression so far as I can see.
Anything make you mad anymore?
Anything make me mad? Well, I learned a long time ago that it doesn't do any good to become mad. So nothing has really made me mad. I may object strenuously to certain things, but that's not the same as being mad. What makes me mad, if you want to use that phrase, goes back to the idea that it is incredible that we can continue with a system under which we elect people to Congress who, once they got there, try to figure out how they can get us, how they can use our money to buy our votes.
Vancouver, Washington, you're next.
Dr. Friedman, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you taking my call. And I wanted to start by saying, after reading your book, Free to Choose, I decided to major in economics at the University of Washington. It was in a low-level economics class that I read that. And I think it's to economics what Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, is to astrophysics. But my question has to do with deficit spending and the national debt and their actual versus perceived impact on interest rates and the economy as a whole. I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Well, the question about national debt, the national debt is really a situation under which, in the main, we tax some people to pay interest to other people. But in some cases, the same people, because the national debt is in the main owned by residents of the United States. The national debt has some virtues as well as some disadvantages. For example, we now issue in the national debt purchasing power securities. That is, issue securities that are indexed against inflation. That was a pet project of mine for many, many years. I remember one of the things I was disappointed with in the early Reagan administration. I was trying to persuade the then Treasury Secretary, Donald Regan, that the Treasury should issue purchasing power securities. It's something that's of great advantage to the public at large. It enables them to have some way in which they can have some assets that are fully protected against inflation. And it would have enabled the government to borrow at a lower interest rate. But unfortunately, Don, being a creature of Wall Street and having had all his experience in Wall Street, couldn't see it, and he was unwilling to do it. But finally, it's happened, and we have such purchasing power securities. And that part of the national debt, from my point of view, is a great benefit to the country.
Do you know what the letter, whoops, I dropped the book, letter series is on that? Is it, it's not the P series, is it?
I don't know.
I've heard the advertisements for them.
But you can get them. I mean, any broker will buy them for you.
And that moves with inflation.
Yes, that's right. Both the payment is adjusted for inflation and the capital value is adjusted for inflation. So it's a completely purchasing power corrected security. But to go back to the what the caller is asking about, I think what he's referring to is all this present talk about paying off the national debt. Now, I believe that we would be much better off, rather than paying off the national debt, to reduce taxes. And the reason I say that is because we won't continue to pay off the national debt. As soon as the political situation changes a little, that money will be spent by the government. It will not be used to pay off the national debt. All of these predictions that the national debt will be gone 3-5 years from now, I would be willing to wager 10 to 1 that will never happen.
Rose Friedman will join us in about 25 minutes. How long have you two known each other again?
Oh, we've known each other since 1932. How many years is that? 68 years.
How long have you been married?
62 years.
What's been the secret of staying together?
That we love one another. And tolerance. I think the most important single word for living is tolerance. In every area, intellectual, political, personal.
Oklahoma City, you're next.
Hi, Dr. Friedman. I just want to say that I admire you very much. If everybody would read your book in the United States, I think they would understand and see through the forest. I also wanted to say that next to F.A. Hayek, you're one of the greatest people in the economics profession that I've ever read. Specifically, my question is, do you ever worry about our trade deficits? They've continued to grow over the years. Could you expound on that a little bit? And,
sure.
Do you think that we're in the middle of a credit expansion that could collapse possibly? And I just want to say thank you.
So far as the last, there's no sign of an unsustainable credit expansion. The best index of that is to see what is happening to the quantity of money. And the quantity of money has been going up for the past year or so, only at a rate of about 3 to 5, 6%. It's been going up at about the rate that you need to have it go up to match the growth in output. So I don't think there's any problem of a credit expansion. Now, on the first part, I guess my age is showing. What was the first part of it?
Well, I was going to tell you that both of our ages are showing, because I was sitting here thinking, we'll think about it in a minute. Why don't we go on, and we'll come back to it by the way, before I take the next call, how many times in your life have you told the pencil story?
Oh, millions of times. I don't know. That pencil story is a wonderful story. It originates with Leonard Read, who was at the time ran the Foundation for Economic Education.
When? What year?
Oh, that goes back to about 1950, I would say. Something like that. And you know, the pencil story, do you want me to tell it again, I take it?
Let me take this call because they're waiting, and then we'll come back. Yeah, before this is over, I want you to tell. You told it on book notes, so you'd have to tell it again. Aberdeen, Maryland, go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Brian. I have to say as well, it's a great pleasure for me, second only to the possibility of going to a driving range with Tiger Woods to ask Dr. Friedman a question. Sir, specifically with the Keynesians, a lot has been said, written, and lectured about your economic model, Vice John Maynard Keynes. Can you expound a little bit on your views of monetarism, the use of it in overcoming what economists call a liquidity trap, especially with the recessions and depressions. And can you give us your views a little bit on this concept of a liquidity trap? And I'll hang up now unless you have a further question for me and listen to your answer, sir.
Before you talk about liquidity traps, when did John Maynard Keynes live?
John Maynard Keynes lived, he was born late in the 19th century, I'm not sure just when, and he died, what, 1955, something like that.
Did you ever meet him?
No, I never met him.
And he lived in Great Britain all his life?
Oh, he lived in Britain all the time. John Maynard Keynes, let me make it clear, he was a great economist, a very great economist. Many of his works are valuable today. A book on monetary reform that he wrote in 1925 is still worth reading today for what it has in it. He was a great economist. His book, The General Theory of Employment, Exchange, and Money, which is what really made him world famous, and it's what's known as Keynesianism, is an important book. I believe it's fundamentally wrong, but that doesn't mean it isn't important. You know, you get developments in science only by people putting forth hypotheses, most of which are wrong. And it's out of the revisions that come out from correcting the wrong hypotheses that you get closer to the truth. You never get to the truth. You're still always going there, but you get closer.
What about liquidity traps?
So on the liquidity, the liquidity trap was something that came out of Keynes's work, out of that book, General Theory. And I believe there is no such thing. What the liquidity trap was, the idea that you would get to, that if interest rates got low enough, people would get to a point where they didn't care whether they held bonds or money or cash. So that if you tried to stimulate the economy by increasing the quantity of money, and the way you increase quantity of money is by buying bonds, people would simply accept that additional money, hold it in cash, and not spend it, so that you wouldn't have any stimulating effect from the increasing quantity of money. Now, I believe that, and let me emphasize, Keynes raised that possibility, but he himself said we have never observed one so far. And to the best of my knowledge, we never have observed one. The closest we've come to it is in Japan currently, and that's because of bad Japanese monetary policy, not because there's really a liquidity trap.
We got a couple more books here just quickly so that we can get them all in. This is one that you did a debate with Robert Russo?
That's a debate with Robert Russo on free versus, that's an interesting case, of free versus fixed exchange rate. At the time we had that debate, everybody was in favor of fixed exchange rates except a relatively few crazy people from the University of Chicago. Today, nobody is in favor of them in that same sense.
Here's Walter Cohen, another debate?
Yes, that was a debate about Social Security, about whether Social Security should be universal or selective.
Did these books sell any, of any degree in it? Were they of any income value to you?
Oh, no income value. Those books, no. I should say, I get royalty on very few of these books. Free to Choose, some of them.
Your autobiography and the...
But on the major scientific books, I don't get any royalty on those. They were published by the organizations that sponsored the research. Those two books of debates were sponsored by the American Enterprise Institution in Washington. They were published by the American Enterprise Institute. And insofar, I'm sure they lost money on them, but if there were any royalties, they got it. I didn't.
Lewisburg, Tennessee, for Dr. Milton Friedman. You're next.
Yes, I got a question for you, and you just held up the book there on Social Security, so that's kind of what interests me, because I'm a younger person, and politicians, of course, I try not to listen to them too much because I don't get many facts. But as far as Social Security, there's a debate going on in that arena as whether or not I can take some of my money and invest it. And I'd like to personally take it all and invest it because then I can see a profit. But is this viable? I mean, where are my arguments bad or good on this? I don't know.
Your arguments are good on this from my point of view. I believe Social Security should be 100% privatized, not simply 25% privatized. I believe that Social Security is not a good system. You know, people talk about being fair and just. Here we have a system under which you're a young man, but let's take a different case, a hard case. Here's somebody who's 45 years old and has AIDS. He's got 10 years to live at the most if he's lucky. And the government comes along and says, you have to put aside 16% of your wages for your old age. Does that make any sense? It's a crazy thing for him to be doing. Why don't we let people decide for themselves what fraction of their income they want to save for their old age and the form in which they want to save it? Social Security came out of the Great Depression, and it came out of the idea that people were not able to save and provide for their own retirement. The difficulties in the Great Depression were not due to unwise behavior by individuals. It was due to unwise behavior by government. And once you cured that unwise behavior by government, from my point of view, the ideal situation would be to let people save for themselves. Then people will say, well, but some of them will be imprudent, and they'll end up in their old age as charges upon the state. Well, I agree we ought to have a program to make sure that nobody starves. We ought to have a program, a basic safety net at the very bottom. But why should that be different for people who are there because they're old, or because they're disabled, or because they had an accident, or for other reasons? So in my ideal world, every individual would decide for himself. You would decide for yourself. At the moment, that's not politically feasible. But privatizing part of it would be at least a step in the right direction.
We're coming to you from San Francisco at the ITN studios. Dr. Milton Friedman is our guest in this 3-hour in-depth program on Connie Broad's Book TV. Connie is our executive producer and back in Washington on this day, and Susanna Frankel is here as our producer on scene with our director, Brett Betzel. And we're looking at all these books that Dr. Friedman has written or he's a part of, including his new autobiography called Two Lucky People, new meaning the last couple of years. How did it sell? Was it satisfactory for you?
I really don't know quite, but no, it wasn't satisfactory. Of course, we wanted it to sell in the millions, and it sold in the tens of thousands.
And what was the approach that you and your wife took on this book?
Well, the approach we took was to decide that instead of writing it jointly, we would write it in selective pieces. So most of it, each piece is labeled either Milton or Rose, so we can speak in two voices. That was a suggestion of our editor at Harcourt Brace.
Let's go to Long Beach, California next for Dr. Friedman.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Greg, and I'd just like to say I'm a disciple of Dr. Friedman, and I like his comments specifically on the negative income tax for replacement of welfare, and a comment on how the Democratic candidates in popular culture keep pushing class envy.
Well, on the latter part of that, I think it's too bad to push class envy. One of the great things about the United States is that we really don't have classes. I entered this world in the lowest class in our society. I entered in what was, my parents were poor immigrants. Neither one of them ever graduated from high school. He's showing me pictures that I like to see.
Which one is this right here while you're talking about it?
I mean, that's the Nobel Prize in Stockholm, 1976. And that's the King of Sweden leaning over to shake my hand.
And you were talking about class envy. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but...
No. I'm not sure what that... that picture is in
Buthelezi.
South Africa.
Yeah.
With Agacha Buthelezi. Great man. Talking about class envy, as I say, my parents, neither one of them ever graduated from high school or from anything like that. So I was in the bottom class, but I'm not in the bottom class anymore. And that's true for a great many people. Very few people who were in the United States, the great thing about the United States is openness. The fact that people aren't stuck where they start. This is a great contrast to Europe. In most European countries, there's still a good deal of rigidity. It's much more difficult for a person from a working class. It's possible, but it's much more difficult and unusual for a person from a working class to work himself or his children up into a higher class than it did in the United States.
I need to take a call, and then if you make it relatively brief, I want you to tell the pencil story before we break to bring your wife on board here. Bel Air, Maryland, you're next.
Brian, I'll be as quick as I can. I just wanted to know if the doctor could comment on a recent, actually it was earlier on C-SPAN, I believe it was the Economic Policy Institute, a think tank in D.C. that just released a study. They do it every 2 years. I don't know if you could perhaps help me out, Brian, on the title of that, and the gentleman you had on, I believe it was on just C-SPAN a few hours ago, Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah, it was a call, and I saw a little bit of it, but I don't remember the titles of everything.
Yes, and he referred to the growing disparity in income, and I was wondering if the doctor could speak to that, as well as that I think the doctor's view is that taxes have not remained a constant as in terms of relative income over the last 20 years, whereas this report, I do believe, showed that the taxes have remained the same over the last 20, income on taxes has remained the same over the last 20 years. That's what the report was saying. Would the doctor agree with that is the question. And if I can I hang on the line and ask one more and have you respond?
Well, I don't know. Let me take these up. First, so far as I'm not sure what you mean by taxes on income have remained the same. If we take the total tax receipts of federal, state, and local governments, they are at the highest point as a fraction of national income that they have been since World War II. And indeed, I believe they are roughly equal to the level reached at the height of the World War II. So I don't know what's your quick follow-up, Carl?
No, I'm speaking about the actual personal income. It was what the study. This was about workers. This is released on Labor Day about workers. And the other question was, can you speak to education as an investment? And I'll hang up and listen.
Well, let me go back to your first question about inequality. If you look at the statistics of inequality, they do show growing inequality in wage. But that's inequality in 1 year's income, not in lifetime income. Moreover, the statistics in the United States are very much affected by the fact that over the past 10 or 20 years, we've had some 16 million immigrants come into the United States. And they have mostly come in from countries in which they were at a relatively low income level. They have mostly come in at the bottom income level in the United States. If you take those out, there's much less evidence of a widening inequality of income. But in any event, there's nothing to be worried about the inequality of income so far as I can see, as long as we're open so that people who rise can also fall, and people who fall can also rise. What we want is openness. It would be an awful world in which everybody had exactly the same equal income and it was equal in every way. You wouldn't want to live in a world in which everybody was your duplicate.
Pencil story.
You want the pencil story. This is a story which was told by Leonard Reed, as I said before, and it's a question of nobody, the original story was labeled I Pencil. Nobody knows how to make me. There's no single individual in the world who knows how to make a simple yellow lead pencil with a piece of what's called lead, which is really graphite. Yellow lead pencil with a piece of what's called lead, which is really graphite, in the middle. Thousands of people are involved in making this one pencil. After all, the wood comes from timber, which is from maybe trees cut down in Oregon or California. In order for those trees to be cut down, there had to be saws. In order for the saws to be made, there had to be steel mills. In order for the steel mills to be there, they had to be, and so on. The graphite comes probably from Chile, which is where somebody had to discover the graphite mines and mines it out. The little red eraser at the top, that comes from trees which were originally native to Brazil and which businessmen, some people who found them, transferred them to Malaysia, and they grew the rubber trees in Malaysia. And then he went on about the little tin strip, and he went through and saying there are thousands of people who cooperated to make this one little pencil, which you can go down to the store and buy for a dime or 15 cents. Those people cooperated with one another in making it, even though they didn't know one another, even though they were of different religions. They might have hated one another if they met. Maybe they'd fight with them, but they cooperated. What brought them together to cooperate? Was there somebody up high who was sending orders down to the people in Chile to dig the graphite, to the people in Malaysia to take the rubber? No. They were all coordinated through the marvels of a free market price system. in which if there wasn't enough wood, the price of wood would tend to rise, and that would encourage people to produce more wood. If there wasn't enough graphite, the price of graphite would rise, and so on. It's a marvelous example of the way in which the free market enables people to cooperate together for a common good. When you go to the store and get one of those pencils without knowing it, you are trading a few minutes of your own time for a few seconds of the time of each of the thousands of people who went into that thing. Consider how complex it would be for some one person to give orders out for all that. Isn't it a wonderful story? I told it much better on TV because I was primed for it.
Dr. Milton Friedman and In Depth will continue with his wife Rose for another hour in just about 5 minutes.
Book TV's live in-depth conversation with Milton Friedman resumes in about 5 minutes. Next month, a live in-depth conversation with novelist, playwright, and essayist Gore Vidal. Join us the first Sunday of each month at noon Eastern for Book TV's author interview series, In Depth. Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Join us for a look at the world of nonfiction books and the publishing industry, Saturday morning at 8 through Monday morning at 8 Eastern. 48 hours of nonfiction books, all weekend, every weekend, on Book TV. Now, from Book Expo America in Chicago, the country's largest book industry trade show, a preview of some of the new books coming out this fall.
David Rosenthal, among the titles that Simon & Schuster is coming out with this fall is this book, An Invitation to the White House, by Hillary Rodham Clinton. Tell us about this book.
This is a book Mrs. Clinton has been working on for some time because she feels strongly that the White House is more than a presidential residence, but it is really the people's house. And she feels that one of the accomplishments of their administration has been Americanizing the White House, Americanizing the type of entertainment, the type of cuisine that's been served there, the type of functions that the White House has been used for. Not just for foreign press conferences, but of course for meetings of civic leaders, for meetings of think tanks and whatnot. And she really feels, and I think she believes, that this book is part of her legacy as First Lady and of the Clintons' legacy in terms of leaving this house to the public. The book is filled with wonderful behind-the-scenes photos of how functions are put on at the White House and about how they've changed over the years.
Did she approach you or did you approach her?
We've had a long relationship with her. Simon & Schuster published It Takes a Village, and also published the Socks and Buddy book about letters to the White House. So this was something I think that was talked about mutually. But she really felt strongly it has been a passion of hers, making the White House more contemporary, making it more of a people's house that everybody could be proud of.
Right next to it is another book, a very different book, Hunter S. Thompson, The Gonzo Letters, Volume 2.
He does not live in the White House, as you probably know, Hunter. But Hunter is also as American in some ways as the Clintons are. He is a national treasure. His first book of letters, Proud Highway, was published about 4 years ago, and that covered the beginning of his childhood almost in Louisville to the late 60s. This one takes us through sort of vintage Hunter Thompson, through the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas years until the fall of Saigon in 1975.
Well, I note here that it's edited by Douglas Brinkley, forward by David Halberstam. Two pretty big names there.
They are, not as big as Hunter himself, of course. But Doug Brinkley has worked with Hunter on a number of projects, including the first volume of letters. He really has treated Hunter as one of the great natural American writers. And Halberstam really goes back to those days of Hunter of being just one of the great new journalists of our time. And he has always been an enormous fan, as I think anybody who loves fun writing and recklessness certainly likes.
I noted also Stephen Ambrose has a new book. What's that?
Stephen Ambrose is writing in a way what is, in some ways, the natural sequel to Undaunted Courage. Because what this book is really the opening of the American West by the railroad. This is the history of the Transcontinental Railroad, and in some ways it picks up where Lewis and Clark left off.
It's titled Nothing Like It in the World?
Nothing Like It in the World. And, excuse me, what Ambrose has been particularly wonderful at is not only telling the story of the building of the railroad, but really the people who built the railroad. This is the telling of the building of the railroad in a way from the point of view of the laborers, of the engineers, of sort of the smaller people who created this thing. It's the same way he dealt with D-Day and with World War II. He's dealing with the creation of the railroad. It's an utterly majestic and splendid book.
The next book, much more contemporary, Eyewitness to Power by David Gergen.
David Gergen, some people think, was there when they built the railroad, actually, but rather instead he has been there through the last 5 administrations. And what's wonderful about Gergen is that he's been able to work for, obviously, not only Nixon and Ford, who is extremely fond of in the book and who he really feels history is underrated, and President Reagan, but was the way that he was able to come in and advise President Clinton. He really is one of those people in Washington who has seen it all. And he's a very good-natured man, but also a very astute observer of what goes on there.
Any other particular titles that you yourself are particularly excited about?
One book that I think is a real sleeper and a wonderful book for us is a book called Today I Am a Boy. And this is by an author named David Hayes, who wrote a book called My Old Man in the Sea, which was a book about sailing around the world in a boat with his son, which was a big bestseller a few years ago, widely praised. And this is a book about how this man in retirement at age 70 decided to go to Hebrew school and become bar mitzvahed, which he had never done as a child. And it's really a look at exploring how it is to get old, how it is to try and find what you might have missed in your youth. It's one of the most elegiac, beautifully written books I've seen in some time.
David Rosenthal, Vice President at Simon & Schuster. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What's a good book that you've read?
Well, the good book I read recently is Matt Ridley's The Genome, which is a study of genetics and the whole new science of microbiology. And I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian. But I found it very interesting and very lively, very interesting, well-written, accessible. And one of those books you understood it as I went along, but I couldn't explain it once I was through.
Do you think that the book has any implications for politics or public policy?
Oh, sure, because this is all the stuff about genetic engineering is in there, and I mean, material about that, about possible research on cures for cancer, the idea of patenting certain genes, all that's discussed. There's lots of pitfalls of public policy in this book, but he's an Englishman, so he's not, you know, inside the Washington loop, but he's talking about pitfalls generally, globally, about this whole experiment, also some of the excitements of it.
Culture and Imperialism by Edward Said.
What is the subject of that book? Why did you read it?
I read it for my dissertation that I'm writing, and it's all about how culture and art, literature are affected by politics. Imperialistic politics specifically is what that book's about.
Great book I've read and sort of keep returning back to is Edward Abbey's Fool's Progress. I read it when it first came out a number of years ago, right after his death. It encapsulates everything Edward Abbey was about, sort of the disgruntled godfather of the Earth First movement. He mythologizes the American environment, the American people, salt of the earth.
Robert D. Putnam's Bowling Alone, a sociological study that I feel is comparable to David Rezian's famous The Lonely Crowd many years ago. He emphasizes the greater fragmentation and atomization of American people as a reflection of their culture, cultural conditions, the breakdown in community, and the fact that the value system is no longer coherent, organized.
This summer I completed this series, The Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell, which consists of 4 books, and I very much enjoyed that. And I also recently completed Hermann Hesse's The Steppenwolf. I prefer to read classics, so those are the types of books I read.
Now we continue our live, in-depth conversation with author and economist Milton Friedman.
For the last 2 hours, Rose Friedman, your husband's had all all the say. Did you hear him say?
He usually does.
He
yes.
does?
I heard it all. I heard it all.
You're, anything you hear
I never like to talk very much.
Why is that?
He does the talking. I don't know. It's in my genes.
So what role? I mean, your pictures are on the cover of a couple of these important books.
And I had an equal role in writing it. And I've done, everything I've done is by what I add in writing, but I never go out to speak about it.
Why not?
And I refuse to be on the television program, Free to Choose. I was very careful to stay. I did a lot of the planning. We planned all the discussion while we were doing the program. And nothing was done in advance. And then I got out of the way.
Do you have any reason why you don't like the speaking part?
No, I think maybe I don't really like to compete. He speaks well, and he's done it all his life. So why should I compete with him?
I asked him why it has worked all these 60
That's one of the reasons.
Years.
We've never competed with one another.
And what about economics in your life? Are you trained in economics?
I was trained fine, but when we got married, my idea of being married, at least at the beginning, was very different from what people these days feel about getting married.
What was it?
I did not intend to have a career that attempted to equal my husband's. And that was one of the sources of our success.
And where did your family come from?
My family came from what was Russia when we were there. And it's now, I don't know, somewhere in Russia. Well, not Russia anymore. It's the Ukraine, I guess. I've never really kept much track of what's happened to it because I was an infant when I left. I really have no ties to that part of the world.
Where did you grow up?
In Portland, Oregon.
And how did your parents get there? Under what circumstances?
You mean, why did they get there?
Yeah, to Portland.
Well, I guess the main reason was that our relatives were there. My father came before we did. In fact, he came to the United States twice. And at the second time, he earned enough money to send for the rest of us.
And you went to Reed College out there for a couple of years. Why did you transfer?
Well, primarily because my brother was really responsible for my complete education. And he wanted me to go with him to Chicago when he first went there on a very modest salary, something like, I don't know whether it was as much as $2,000 a year, but he thought we could both live on it. But my mother thought I was too young, and she wouldn't let me leave when I graduated from high school. So I went to Reed for 2 years, and by that time, my brother persuaded her that I was old enough, and he was going to be there too. So I went to Chicago.
Do you remember the first time you met this man?
Yes, I do.
Where was it?
At the university in the first graduate course in price theory. Professor Viner arranged you've heard this story so many times probably, arranged the class alphabetically so he could identify people once he saw them a few times. Milton's name began with F, mine with D. So we sat next to one another. And I always complete that story with, I was the only girl in the class.
Only one in the entire class? Was that the same kind of ratio you found in other classes there at Chicago?
Mostly in economics. There were very few, very few. The women went into social service.
This was graduate school. And in the 30s, very few women went into graduate school.
You told me briefly before we went on the air that you completed your work for your doctorate but didn't get your PhD.
That's right.
Why not?
Why not? I worked on it for 1 year after we were married, but during that year I also had a job. And so I didn't get a great deal done on it. After that, we moved around from one place to another. 1 year in Wisconsin, 1 year in Washington, 1 year in New York. I'd forgotten what the sequence was. And then we decided we wanted to have a family. And that took a long time.
How many kids?
Only 2, but we lost the first one.
You had 3, but you lost the first one.
We had 3. The first one was lost at delivery. So that took 1 year out of my life. Then we went back to Washington, and I went to work again, and then quit with the hopes that that would help to produce a child.
Where are your 2 children today?
Both are in California at last. Well, our daughter has been in California ever since she went to Berkeley. She decided then that she was never going to leave California, and she never has. She graduated from Berkeley, and then she went to Berkeley Law School, got her degree there, and started practicing in San Francisco, as a matter of fact. We were not here yet, and she stayed here.
And what about, I know your son David, we've had on Book Notes.
He was in Chicago, at the University of Chicago for 5 or 6 years, and finally came out to California too. He's now at the University of Santa Clara.
We're going to go to the phones very shortly, and our guests here on our special in-depth program from San Francisco on Book TV are Dr. Milton Friedman and his wife Rose Friedman, who is also here on the cover of Free to Choose, which is, I guess, your most successful book.
Yes.
Money-wise,
at any rate.
Yeah. What do you remember about working together on this particular book?
Well, that was very easy, as Milton has already said. We had the television program notes, and the book was written really from that. And so we each started with one chapter and then handed it to the other person to go over the chapter, and we went back and forth that way, so that in the end we really don't know who wrote which words, which is true about all the books we've written.
And that was probably finished in the shortest time because we had a deadline for it. We wanted to have it out in time to be available when the TV program, television program was shown. And so we started on it in March of 1979, and we got it to the publisher by Labor Day, and they got it published by January, which was when the TV program started.
When you're working together on these projects, what does she do that you don't, and what does he do that you don't?
I don't think there is anything.
Nothing.
Both you type, you both edit.
We both type, we both use the computer now.
And before we take our first call, we've talked a little bit about aging, both of you 88 years old.
That's right.
Are you surprised at how well you do? I mean, for those who can't see these two people, they move around as well as I do and anybody else.
Everybody says we are bouncing around. I don't feel that we're bouncing around, frankly. There are many things I can't do today that I used to be able to do. I don't have the energy I used to have. So it's getting old is no fun.
Is there any advice you have for people as if they knew they were going to live to be 88, would you do anything differently?
If what?
If you knew you were going to live this long, would you have done anything different?
No, I don't. Well, I think we would have lived more extravagantly. We were always saving our pennies. My brother used to say we were saving our pennies for a rainy day that never came.
No, he used to say...
I saved my pennies.
He would say you're saving your pennies for a rainy day and living in a perpetual drizzle.
Okay.
Phoenix, Arizona, you're on. Yes, go ahead, please.
Brian?
Yeah.
I really love this program. This is first time I've ever been able to get through, so it's really nice. And also everything on C-SPAN is great. I have a question for Dr. Friedman. I'm not sure I know exactly how to phrase this, but the gross national product is like I don't know, it's an economic thing that involves all the positive inputs from government and industry and everything, but it has nothing to do with negatives like fighting forest fires and earthquakes and environmental pollution. And I just wonder if maybe there's a better way to deal with those kinds of things. Instead of having a gross national product, have something that shows negatives instead of just positives.
Thanks, caller.
Well, what you call negatives enter into the gross national product as positives. After all, part of the gross national product consists of the money and resources that are spent in fighting fires. That's a component of the gross national product. So that ends up as a product, not as a negative. It's a cost of averting the negative. There have been, your suggestion is a very important one and has been very widely considered, trying to have an alternative measure which would give you a measure of the gross national goods, as it were, of the good part of the product. Unfortunately, it's so hard to separate the one from the other. What some people would regard as fighting evil, other people would regard as good. For example, There are many people who would regard the money spent on cigarettes as part of the evil component. But to those who smoke cigarettes, they regard it as part of the good component. There are many people who would put many of the high-calorie foods we eat as part of the evil part. But to those who eat them, that's part of the good part. So it's extremely hard to make such judgments. After all, the judgments of what's good and evil are individual, while gross national product is intended to be an objective measure. So it's really a measure of input rather than output.
Rose Friedman, do you disagree with your husband on economic theory in any way?
Very rarely. On, rare occasions.
Did you start from the same point? Did you agree in the beginning?
That's right. We learned from the same teachers. Our home, we grew up very much in the same kind of home. And there was no reason why one should go one way and one should go the other way.
New Orleans, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Friedman.
Which Dr. Friedman?
Well, Dr. Milton. Well, either of them, whichever. I've been wanting I have a question that I have been wanting to ask someone knowledgeable about this situation for a long time. It seems to me, with all this push for a minimum wage, that that's going to automatically lead to galloping inflation. I haven't heard anyone comment on this. It's just my own idea. What do you think?
Let's ask Rose Friedman. What do you want?
I didn't get it.
The question is whether or not the minimum wage will lead to galloping inflation if you raise it.
If you raise it?
Yes.
I don't think it'll lead to galloping inflation, but it'll lead to a lot of unemployment.
Why?
Because people who are hiring, the entrepreneurs that are hiring these people, don't feel that they can pay them more. And therefore, they would reduce their employees.
At this time in the discussion in Washington, there's a sense, and it's just a distant sense, that they're going to pass an increase, both the Republicans and the Democrats. Why are the Republicans going to go along with this, do you know?
Republicans are going along with everything these days.
Well, the Republicans are going to go along with it because it's superficially politically profitable. Right. You know, the problem with these things is that on the surface, things look very good. After all, what's wrong with raising the minimum wage? Isn't it nice for people to have a higher minimum wage? The problem is that the indirect effects, which are unseen, more than counterbalance the good effects. Because as Rose says, if you raise the price, you'll buy less of it, whether it's sugar, automobiles, whatever. The higher the price, the less people will buy. And if wages are higher, people will buy less wages. Now, how would that lead to inflation? There is an element of truth in what this gentleman is saying, and that is that if you raised the minimum wage too much and created massive unemployment, there would be a great pressure to do something about that unemployment. What would that pressure lead to? It would lead to inflation as a way of really reducing the real value of that minimum wage. You asked about why the Republicans will agree to a $1 minimum wage increase over 2 years. Part of the reason they'll agree to it is because it isn't really a raise. It's a raise in nominal terms, but prices have been going up. You haven't had much inflation, but you've had 3 or 4 or 5% inflation over the last few years. So $6.15 2 years from now is probably about the same level of real minimum wage as $5.15 was 2 years ago.
San Lorenzo, California. Go ahead, please.
And good morning to your distinguished guests, the Friedmans. My wife is from the Republic of the Philippines, and she's obviously awfully concerned about the future there. She has a remaining brother that still lives there with his family. What can your guests offer as to the solution of the problems that exist there now? Thank you.
Part of the problem is Rose Friedman cannot hear very well, so if we could use the speakers, it would be helpful out here. Did you understand the question?
Yes, I understood the question. It has to do with the Philippines. The measures that the Philippines need to take in order to improve their lot are the same as for all underdeveloped countries. And those measures consist first of all, freeing trade, reducing tariffs, restrictions on trade. Second of all, reducing government spending and lowering taxes, deregulating. Those are the measures which have been found everywhere to lead to an improvement in the income of the country and the average income of the people. And without taking those measures, there's little likelihood of improvement.
Greenville, South Carolina. Let's try this one and see if you can hear. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Dr. Friedman. Earlier you made the comment that the wage earner paid 16% of his income towards Social Security. I was impressed that you said that, because that's one of my pet peeves is most people don't realize they think they only pay 7% or 7.5%, and the employer has to pay the other half. And my question is, currently, as I understand it, the government, we are taxed for Social Security. We pay Social Security benefits today, and then we have an additional amount that we're taxed for future shortfalls. Now, when it comes time for those shortfalls to be paid, how will we pay for those shortfalls if we don't have a surplus in our income tax?
You're absolutely right. That's one of the great fallacies in this area. This is purely paper. The so-called surplus available for Social Security is a pure paper entry. It's what one part of the government owes another part of the government. And when the time comes that current receipts from Social Security taxes are not enough to pay current benefits, the difference will be paid either by reducing other spending, or by increasing taxes, or by borrowing from the public. There is the lockbox is a bunch of, is a fiction, a figment of the imagination. You don't have pieces of paper in there. You have pieces of paper in there saying the government of the United States owes this lockbox so much money. How can the government get that money? Either from taxes, or from cutting spending, or from borrowing from the public. No other way.
Rose Friedman, in your opinion, what's the best way to learn economics?
Be married to Milton Friedman.
Do you yourself read about economics anymore?
Well, I don't read any more about economic theory. I read about the things that you read in the journals, some of them, although the journals more recently have become so mathematical that even he doesn't read them.
What do you read when you have time yourself?
What do I read when I have time? By the time I finish reading all of the journals that come into the house and the Wall Street Journal from page 1 to page X, I'm just about through. Occasionally, I will read a good mystery, but not very often.
And do you read the New York Times any more than he does?
The books
I don't read it even as much as he does, because I don't read the paper the night before on the net.
I should say that the last book I read was Bill Buckley's recent book.
And I'm in the middle of it.
The novel or the
novel?
On speeches, yeah. Lafayette, Indiana.
I read the speeches. That's a wonderful book of speeches. I think Bill's book, I think Bill is a remarkable character.
Lafayette, Indiana, you're our next caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you for Dr. Milton Friedman. In the last 10 to 15 years, farmers, farm income, and farm economy has lagged behind the general economy. Do you have any solutions for this situation? Thank you, and I've enjoyed your work.
There is no solution to it. If you take, it's interesting to take the long view in this. When the United States became a nation, 19 out of 20 people were on the farms to growing the food for the remaining 1 person. Today, 1 or 2% of the people are on the farms, growing food for the remaining 98, and with enough to export abroad in large measure. Because of the technological changes and improvements that have come along, agriculture has been a declining industry for 200 years. And it will continue to be a declining industry because the demand for the food that agriculture grows is not very elastic. After all, there's a limited amount of food of the physical kind. The luxury elements of food go into the preparing of it, the chefs, the fancy restaurants, and so on. But so far as the actual products of the farms are concerned, that demand goes up relatively slowly. So, unfortunately, the agriculture will not be a growing industry in your lifetime.
Rose Friedman, what do you think of just the overall state of...
on that, we're also importing a great deal of our food these days that we never imported before. You go to the store and most of the fruit comes from either Chile or Peru or you name it.
Good or bad?
Well, it's good if it didn't come so hard that you had to keep it for 2 weeks before it was edible. But it's very good because it means that we have food at a lower price and plenty of it. People eat things now that we never even dreamed about years ago.
How many of these different books sitting out here have you had something to do with?
Oh, I don't know.
I mean, did you have anything to do with this one?
Which one?
Oh, yes.
That one would never have appeared if I hadn't started it, frankly.
You hadn't started it?
If I hadn't started
writing it?
Right. Is that right?
Well,
more or less?
More. No. That was based on a series of lectures I gave at a summer session of a foundation.
Right.
And she took the notes, the transcript of those lectures. And it was her initiative that organized the transcripts of those lectures into the book.
And how did this book do? Was it a good seller?
Well, it didn't do very well at the beginning because it was not a popular, the ideology in it was not very popular.
What was the main theme?
The main theme was freedom of markets and freedom of people.
Ithaca, New York, you're next.
Yes, hello. In regards to economic theory, you both are very influential to the Libertarian Party. I was wondering, are you libertarians? And if not, why?
As I said earlier, we're libertarians with a small L, but we're not members of the Libertarian Party. And that's strictly for practical reasons.
How about your politics? Any different at all?
No, my politics are the same. I'm a libertarian in the sense that I believe that people ought to be free to make their own decisions and plan their own life.
How much government should there be?
As little as possible.
And what
the things we can't get away with, like the Army, has to be government. When people are really so poor that they don't have a place to live and food to eat, it's up to the government. It's up to the people, really. Years ago, it was done individually by people doing their own charity. You didn't go to the government for charity. The same thing is true of medical care. You know, the big argument now is that poor people, when they get old, have medical care. People have always had medical care. They didn't use it to the extent that we do today, but they were just as well off. And the doctors did a lot of charitable medical work, which they don't do anymore.
Corona, California. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Brian. Love your show. Got a lot of respect for the Friedmans. I've heard from several different people now that in America today, for a young man and woman starting out, earning $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year, getting married, buying a home, saving for college for the kids, that it's virtually impossible for them to save and accumulate enough money after taxes to have them retire at age 65 in the same world that they've become accustomed to. And I'd like your comments on that.
I think people can't afford to live and save for their children's education and so on $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year because their desires have become so much greater than they used to be. People feel that a year after they're married, they should own their own home. We never owned our own home, and then it was only because when we moved to Chicago, they had rent control. And we couldn't find an apartment or a house to rent. So we bought a miserable house that we could own. We did what little we could, and we kept it for about a year and a half. And then it was a matter of either keeping the house or one another.
In one of your books, you talk about Chancellor Earhart taking controls off in like 1948 after the war.
That's right.
And it had, you think, a big impact.
Oh, a tremendous impact, and no question.
In Germany.
In Germany. The week before, there was nothing in the windows of stores. People, the week before, people in a factory making pots and pans were putting some pots and pans on their back and going into the country to see if they could get some from farmers, to see if they could get potatoes or some other kind of food. A week after he took off controls, everything was different. Stores were open. There was goods in the stores. People would go to the stores to buy. That was a German miracle of 1948, widely recognized as such. He took them off, I should add. He took off price and wage controls on a Sunday because he knew the American offices would be closed and they couldn't contradict it.
Omaha, Nebraska, you're next.
I'd like to ask Milton Friedman if all the dollars that are outside of the United States, such as in Argentina and elsewhere in the world, as their currency, were to come back to this country, what would happen? And I would like to inquire as to what kind of circumstance would that shift of money be apt to occur. I'm going to hang up and listen. Thank you.
You have to ask how they would come back. How would the money, you have to ask how the dollars from Argentina would come back. In the main case, ways they would come back, they would end up by being destroyed. They wouldn't affect the situation at all. At the moment, in effect, the dollars in Argentina are a zero interest rate loan from the people of Argentina to the United States. We get seniorage on that currency. How could they come back? They could only come back if people in Argentina used them to buy goods and services in the United States. In that case, they would end up in the banks, in the hands of the public, and whether they affected the total amount of money would depend on the monetary policy that the Federal Reserve was pursuing. In short, they are not a danger. On the contrary, they are a free gift to the United States.
Rose Friedman, you wrote a series of articles some time ago in the Oriental Economist
in Japan.
What was that? How did that come about?
That was really the beginning of our autobiography. But I did that all by myself. And they published them in a book in Japanese and wanted to do them in English. I let them publish it in Japan. It didn't make any difference to me. But as far as doing it in this country, I didn't give them permission to do that because I planned that one day we were really going to write a real autobiography.
What were the articles about in Japan?
My life with Milton Friedman.
Why did they want to know about that?
Well, Milton was very popular in Japan at that time. We spent 3 months first, and then we went back more or less at least once a year. And Milton was working with the economists there with the Bank of Japan. And so his name was very important.
Let's go to Portland, Oregon next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I had a question on NAFTA, its effect on the economy of the United States and its effect on the economy of Mexico. And I'll hang up and listen.
Effect of NAFTA on the economy of the United States and Mexico.
Well, NAFTA is a step toward free trade. It's not a free trade. The idea that NAFTA is a free trade agreement, although it says FTA means free trade agreement, it really isn't a free trade agreement because it has all sorts of restrictions. A really free trade agreement would be an opening of the border completely. It would mean any goods could go back and forth without any tariffs. But it has been a step toward free trade, and as a result, it's been very beneficial to both Mexico and the United States. It's benefited Mexico by enabling them to have a greater degree of capital investment from the United States in Mexico, which has provided jobs for Mexicans. It's benefited the United States by enabling us to produce various goods and services more cheaply and to provide them more plentifully to the American people. So we have benefited and they have benefited. It's been a good thing. It would be even better if it were a real, honest-to-God free trade agreement that swept away all barriers to the movement of goods and services across the boundary.
Rose Friedman, how many times have you been to China?
3, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
First time we were under the auspices of the government, or one agency in the government. And we had a Chinese man that traveled with us and an interpreter that traveled with us. And we saw a great deal. But
what year?
That was
80.
80.
And what was the impact on you of seeing China in 1980?
My feeling at that time was that China was going to make it and Russia was not. We also spent a week in Russia, in the Soviet Union earlier.
What did you see the difference in the two?
What did I see of the difference? We didn't feel that there were security people around us all the time. We could take as many pictures as we wanted to. When in Moscow, when we went out to take a picture, we were immediately accosted by a policeman. We were just taking pictures of the buildings around. And there was people didn't quite feel the same about talking to you as the people in the Soviet Union. So I don't know. And the Chinese are so much friendlier people, or seemed to us at any rate, than the Russians were.
Nakamas, Florida, is that right? That's the way you pronounce it? Nakamas. I'm sorry.
Yeah, like the Indian princess, I believe.
You're on the air.
Okay, Dr. Friedman, in connection with the iPencil story, you mentioned Leonard Read, and I remember meeting Leonard Read years ago at a fee seminar, which kind of got me interested in economics ever since then. And right now, I'm reading my way through Ludwig von Mises' Human Action. I never hear much discussion of von Mises in the media or anywhere, and I was wondering if you had any comments on Mr. von Mises.
Von Mises was a very great economist. His writings are well worth reading, though it's a chore to read through Human Action, and I give you high merit marks for doing so. Leonard Read played a major role in enabling von Mises to come to this country from Europe and in supporting him. Von Mises, this is another of these cases where von Mises's ideas were not politically correct at all, and he had great difficulty getting a respectable position in an American university. He was able to stay at NYU only because of private money that helped support him there. He was never really an employee, a full-time, full-class, tenured professor at NYU. It's a disgrace and a shame that should have been the case, because he is a great economist. Now, I have many differences with von Mises, but I have no doubt about his importance. As an economist, his major contribution was not in Human Action, but in a much earlier book on money and credit, which was part of the source of what's called the Austrian theory of the business cycle. It's a very interesting theory. It's another of these theories like Keynes's, which I believe is wrong, but which was important as a stepping stone to the development of the right ideas.
Rose Friedman, in your travels with your husband, all the places you've been, all the books and people you've met, do people treat you differently than they treat him? Did you ever notice?
That varies from country to country. Some places we're equal. In Japan, pretty much, we're equal. Except for, if he goes to a conference on money, I don't go with him. When it's a small conference. But I don't know, I got into the bank in Switzerland, I think, where no woman had ever entered, because I was with him. I don't know. I've never felt that I was being discriminated against.
Have you ever taught?
No.
Ever want to teach?
Never.
Have a favorite professor all those years?
I had a favorite professor. I worked with Frank Knight for 2 years. That's when I finished my graduate work as well. And he was a delight to work for.
At Chicago. University of Chicago.
At Chicago, right.
Los Angeles, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I've got a question for Dr. Friedman. You said that the closest we've come to a liquidity trap is currently in Japan, and that's because of bad Japanese monetary policy rather than a liquidity trap. Could you just expand upon that a little bit, say what it is that the Japanese government has done wrong, and also what policy recommendations would you give to the BOJ or to the Japanese government?
Well, I no difficulty in answering that question. What the Bank of Japan has been doing wrong has been following too restrictive a monetary policy. They're following what they call a zero interest rate policy instead of paying attention to what happens to the quantity of money. They should be increasing the quantity of money more rapidly in order to get out of their deflationary predicament. But so far as Japan as a whole is concerned, the major mistake they've been making, in my, well, it's a combination of things. There are really three things that are involved. Their fiscal policy, the state of the banking industry, and their monetary policy. On fiscal policy, they've been more Keynesian than Keynes. They've had about 8 or 10 different fiscal stimulatory policies, all of which have been a failure, and in my opinion have done more harm than good because they have misinterpreted the Keynesian message. On the banking situation, as a result of the collapse of prices of land particularly and of other items after 1989, every bank in Japan became essentially bankrupt. If they had been really valued reasonably, if all of their assets had been marked to market, they would all have been bankrupt. And it was absolutely essential to clean up the banking industry as a base for further expansion. But you know, Japan is a country in which they face counts for a lot, in which they move as a group, not as individuals, in which they're very unwilling to recognize a situation like that. And the government stood by until about a year or two ago when it took measures to solve the banking crisis. On the monetary policy side, as I say, they should have been increasing the quantity of money more rapidly. And I believe at the moment they should start doing that by buying government securities and increasing their high-powered money.
Buffalo, New York, you're on with Rose and Milton Friedman.
Hello, good afternoon to Brian and his guests, the Friedmans. Brian, if I may, I'd like to discuss three issues. I don't know if you'd allow me to do all of that. The first is Social Security, the second is the tax burden, and the third is class envy. I would like to start with Social Security and address this to Milton Friedman. Mr. Friedman, you answered two questions prior to this on Social Security. The first one, you said you'd like to privatize it. With the second caller, you did agree that there is an unfunded mandate, and there is no such thing as a lockbox. There is no money in there. And we are going to have a shortfall later on. While privatizing it might be nice idealistically, with the situation as it is currently, where current workers are paying for current retirees, there is going to be a transaction cost that has to be talked about. And therefore, what I would ask you to look into is, as the system is set up now, privatizing it is going to cause further problems down the line. Instead, we should look at the qualified plans, the 401ks, the 403bs, which are also through the government because they do allow people to have pre-tax dollars, and use that and maybe ask 3% of all employees to at least put 3% into their qualified plans and allow them to build wealth through that. Trying to shift this into the Social Security problem when we already have a $3 to $5 trillion unfunded mandate is a real problem. If I can continue, or do you want to answer that first?
Why don't you go ahead and answer that?
In the first place, privatizing it does not involve an extra cost. It merely involves recognizing an unfunded cost. We now have unfunded liabilities, and the appropriate way to privatize it would be to fund those. At the same time, you are right. That is not enough. We have had a large increase in average length of life, but we keep retirement age the same. Recently, it's been increased a little bit to 67. You need a further increase in retirement age. You need some adjustment in benefit arrangements in order to make it ultimately economically viable. But beyond that, you could privatize tomorrow, and that would not involve any additional cost. What it would involve would be recognizing as a funded liability what today is this $5 or $7 trillion unfunded liability. Now, it's a very complicated issue she's raising. It's not one that I can handle in a sentence or two. She's got a very real point, don't misunderstand me. And the present talk about it is largely very unrealistic.
What's your second point, caller?
My second question is talking about taxes. And I realize the Friedmans are Republicans, so we're kind of at odds. But the Republicans say we have the largest tax burden based on revenues as a percentage of gross domestic product or gross GDP. But that is really revenues as opposed to tax burden. Revenues, because we've had 22 million new jobs, are higher. The tax burden, and I'm talking specifically regarding the federal tax burden, is really one of the lowest if you look at the top marginal tax rate. There were years when the top marginal tax rate used to be like 98% on the dollar, on the top dollar, and 82%. The top marginal tax rate today is 39.6%, which is even lower than what was in the first Reagan term at 50%. This is not...
Hold on a second so we can get... Rose Friedman, do you want to deal with some of that?
No, I don't want to deal with that at all.
Yes. First of all, so far as marginal tax rates are concerned, you're right, that they're lower than they were immediately after World War II, when during the war you had the tax up to 95, 98%. They are lower at that level, at that marginal level. However, overall, for public at large, as you say, the tax receipts are higher. I thought you were getting at a different point. The burden of the tax is more than what people pay. It's also the costs of obeying the tax and the adjustments that people make in their life to avoid the tax. And that burden is certainly much higher than it has ever been. What you need to do in taxes is to get those marginal rates down, to get all rates down. You've got to cut taxes.
The third point, and we have to move on, but the third point she wanted to talk about class envy, and that right now in the political debate, it's all about class right now.
Absolutely.
Do you think it's unfair?
Well, it doesn't make any sense. After all, it is true that the people with the higher incomes pay most of the taxes. But then they talk about if they're going to have a tax, lowering the tax, it's not fair to lower it at the top.
She said that you two are Republican now. Would you call yourself a Republican today?
I don't know. I'm a conservative, I guess, in a way.
I'm a registered...
We're registered Republicans.
Are you happy with the Republican race at this time?
No.
Why not?
But we're even less happy with the Democratic race.
Why are you not happy with the Republican race?
Because Bush is not really... The Republicans in general, I think, have become so downgraded that they want to be popular. And so everything that Clinton suggests, well, we'll do most of it. And that isn't what the Republicans are supposed to be doing.
You aren't, as of the moment, the Republican Party is not standing on the principles that are really the basic element of the Republican Party. Principle of limited government, of private and not governmental initiative, of individual choice, not collectivist choice. As compared with the Democrats, they're much more on that side than are the Democrats. But they really aren't sticking to the level of principle that, for example, Ronald Reagan did.
Sidney, Nebraska, you're next.
Yes, I wanted to disagree with Mrs. Friedman in her comment that physicians today don't provide free medical care. There are 45 million Americans without insurance. If you've ever covered an emergency room, as I do, a lot of the patients appear there without any insurance at all. And then I disagree with your attitude toward the minimum wage. I think the rising tide lifts all boats. And they just screamed and hollered when they raised the minimum wage last time. They thought all the McDonald's would go broke. You walk down the street of an American city and every fast food place has signed help wanted. And another thing, I think that your philosophy is wrong because you think that government shouldn't really do anything except provide an army. And I think that like Medicare and Social Security have been wonderful programs. I've been a fan of Dr. Friedman for years, and I admire his work. Thank you.
Mrs. Friedman.
Of course, the help wanted signs in the shops, those people don't go to work for the minimum wage. They're places that they have no relationship to the minimum wage. They pay what they have to pay to attract workers.
What about what he said about emergency rooms and the care that people get there?
Well, I don't know. You see, I grew up in a different era. In that era, we were certainly what would today be in the lower poverty level. But we never felt that if we were sick, if we needed a doctor, we couldn't have one. My mother used to pay the bills out 3-6 months at a time. She didn't pay them at once. She used to talk to the doctor at the very beginning about how much he was going to charge. It was all her doing. And doctors did a great deal of emergency work in the county hospitals in those days. They spent a certain fraction of their week in the hospital. So, I don't know.
There are two different things about the charity work. The pattern used to be that there was a sliding scale.
Of course.
That physicians would charge people more or less according to what they thought they could pay. And there was charity work in that sense. What this gentleman is talking about are emergency rooms in hospitals, which are being financed. And the physicians who are working in those emergency rooms are getting a salary. They're getting paid. It's not charity work in the same sense at all. On the minimum wage, my favorite question to people who talk as this gentleman does is to ask him if a $5.15 minimum wage is okay, and you think it should be higher, why are you so niggardly? Why do you stop at $6? Why not $10? Why not $20 an hour? What's wrong with that?
Last call for our guest, Great Falls, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
We were talking a minute ago about President Reagan and real Republicans. A story that needs to be more widely known is the 1981 first cabinet meeting. Professor Friedman may know this. The Energy Secretary had been gotten to by his bureaucracy, and he said, Mr. President, this is too complicated. And President Reagan, who certainly had a clear vision, said, it better not be that complicated, Jim. You got 2 days to work it out.
Good story.
Did you have much access to presidents as your husband was meeting with them over the years? Did you have any desire to be involved in that kind of a world?
No. I was very happy with what I was doing.
But you met Reagan several times.
Oh, I met Reagan. I met Nixon.
When in your life of 88 years have you been the happiest?
That's a good question.
That's a very good question. Huh. I would think
guess it was in the middle.
During the years at Chicago, in 1960s. 50s, 60s.
I guess mostly because we were much more active then. We travel very, very little now. Our traveling consists of going on a cruise, which is good for old people. We don't have to take planes, only one way. We always only take cruises that either start or end in San Francisco. So we have only one flight. But other than that, we do very little traveling. We see a lot of people, at least more than we used to in Chicago. We see everybody from Chicago because San Francisco is a place that everybody wants to come to. But life is kind of as it should.
And in those years, 50s, 60s, our children were growing up. They were, as they still are.
Life is more exciting than it is today.
And do you talk about being 88 and older and...
No, we don't talk about that. We only talk about our aches and our pains now and then, not very often.
Because you said earlier that it's tough getting old.
Well, sure, you can't do all the things you want to do. You can't fly on planes the way you used to.
Have you missed anything?
I can't, yes, sure.
What have you missed?
Until the age of 82, I was both playing tennis and going skiing. And I can do neither now.
But have you missed anything in your life? I mean, things that you wanted to do, either one of you?
Oh. I think we've had a very satisfying life. I find it hard to think of anything I really miss.
I don't feel that we've been discriminated in our life. We've had a good life. We've been very lucky.
That's why we titled that Two Lucky People.
Well, thank you both for joining us. And this is the book that tells the story of their lives, Milton and Rose D. for Director Friedman. And thank you both for spending time with us today. In depth from San Francisco, and our producer, Connie Broad in Washington, and here's Susanna Frankel and Brett Betzel, our director. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Join Book TV for a rebroadcast of our in-depth conversation with Milton Friedman tonight at midnight Eastern. next month.